Hi, this is Steve from iCanPlanet.com. Firstly, I'd just like to let you know that by purchasing this DVD, you are contributing directly to the facilitation of future ICANN events. So a major thank you to everybody for that. If you're listening to my voice right now, then you can count yourself as one of the few people that are completely dedicated to revealing the hidden truths of humanity's potential, and one of the few people that are willing to fight for the cause, to deconstruct the control grid by any means necessary, and bring down the Babylonian mind state once and for all. I hope you enjoy the production as much as I have. All the best from Steve at iCanPlanet.com.
We'll get to some very interesting information in this presentation. I'll give you a little bit of an overview, but it's more like, the point that I've been working with now is that obviously a lot of people in the world know something's really wrong, and it's time to get on the scent of what's wrong. You feel like Doctor Who or, Professor Quatermass, you dig something alien out of the quarry, and you don't know what to do with this stone or whatever, or diamond or crystal or whatever. This thing changes color every minute. It makes strange noises at the night, and you don't know if it's going to explode in your hand any minute, That's what this subject matter is like. So it's okay to know about, all the other interesting aspects. This is something you have to fondle lovingly and look at it from lots of different perspectives. It's not really good to just keep one perspective when you're dealing with a subject matter. I think it's detrimental at the end of the day. Yes, it's very important to know about the royals and the secret governments and the Jews and the Jesuit connection and alien connection. But as you'll see tonight, again, I'll emphasize that maybe a bit more of a subtle type of insight is actually needed at the end of the day. And when you know that there is something wrong in the world, then you have got to be, Piggy Malone about it. You're going to have to go there and do a little bit of homework and research and get on the scent of this predator, basically, that's hiding in the long grass. And get your amateur hat on and go out, as we're doing, and try to discover it. But again, not necessarily just get totally tunnel vision into one aspect. And I hope to prove that point. I can't overemphasize that enough, so as we go, you'll start to see even more what I mean by that. But as I said, I'll give you just a very brief overview of what I think the problem is, what I describe as the threat that surrounds or the threat that awaits. Let's read it together. It's, in the post-human world, we will not experience our own existence as something real. And we're already more than halfway down the road towards this morbid, hyper-real state. Selfhood ends. We function but do not exist. Consciousness as we know it ceases to exist. I mean, these are radical concepts already. Man ceases to be conscious of internal processes because he has emptied, or man has emptied themselves into the Umwelt. We'll get to that later. You thought you were here for pleasure. You're going to all be shot in the head pretty quick. Getting a stiff German lesson, a German language lesson in a minute. There's the door. You can leave anytime. This he does as a pseudo-self. Everything he does, even if it appears noble or spiritual, such as going to a therapist, a counselor, a coach, or joining some apparently progressive sect or cult, is done as a pseudo-self, not as an imperial self. That's just my term for the true self, to distinguish it from the lower self, the ego, and so on. Now, this pseudo-self experiences the positive change. Gimmick cures and trendy solve-alls of every variety imaginable serve to decorate the empty life of the pseudo-self. Activities of this kind have no lasting effect and are merely escapes born from the avoidance of legitimate suffering and legitimate anxiety. Legitimate anxiety? Well, we all thought anxiety is bad. Depression, oh geez, we don't want anything to do with those darker emotions. Legitimate anxiety. The kind that comes with birth, life, and change. Oh, well, psychologists go blue in the face talking about the primal trauma of birth. All right, so there was anxiety at birth. And the intonation is that that's something really bad. Well, then if the anxiety was bad, taking birth was bad. Do we take the anxiety? You take one away, the other goes. I'm glad to be born. I'm glad to exist. So how can I really then be mind-controlled into believing that the anxiety that comes with it is also bad? But unfortunately, that has also happened. So man exists in this future post-human existence. He exists, but he's lost to himself. What I'm basically saying is that it's a case of that thinking becomes extinct, or thinking as we know it becomes extinct. Or even more problematic, it's not so much permission to speak, sir. It's permission to think, sir. And don't laugh, the list is very long of people who've done exactly that and paid the price. And that particular scenario has been predicted by many. No less Aldous Huxley, in his Brave New World Revisited, he says, in 1931, when Brave New World was being written, I was convinced that there was still plenty of time. The completely organized society, the scientific caste system, the abolition of free will by methodical conditioning, the servitude made acceptable by regular doses of chemically induced happiness, that sounds fun, the orthodoxies drummed in by nightly courses of sleep teaching, these things were coming all right, but not in my time, not even in the time of my grandchildren. 27 years later, in this third quarter of the 20th century, I feel a good deal less optimistic, he's not the only one, than I did when I was writing Brave New World. The blessed interval between the too little order and the nightmare of too much has not begun and shows no sign of beginning yet, he's saying. In the West, it is true, individual men and women still enjoy a large measure of freedom. But even in those countries that have a tradition of democratic government, this freedom and even the desire for this freedom seem to be on the wane. In the rest of the world, freedom for individuals has already gone, or is manifestly about to go. The nightmare of total organization has emerged from the safe, remote future and is now awaiting us just around the corner. So these are pretty much the head honchos at the top of the totem pole, already telling us. Now, you meet a Joe on the street and they think you're barmy until you make references like this and say, no, 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 no. The top thinkers, the top academicians have already been warning us about this. What's to come? Well, we all know that imperialism, how can an Irishman not know it? Imperialism, colonization, is based on the old divide and rule. But how many know about the same principle on consciousness itself? Divide and rule, not just in territories and with races and with all sorts of nations and territories. What about here, the territory of the mind? That was what needs to be emphasized again and again and again. And as you've heard me say many times, this fact about the war of consciousness isn't being addressed as much as it should. It's not that it isn't being addressed, it is, but not as much as it should. Consciousness all too often is being left at the door. We go to the horse's mouth. We go to these so-called high priests, you see, of this coming dystopia. Dr. G. Brock Chisholm, he'll tell you all about it. He says, to achieve the world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, the loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas. Well, that's just doublespeak for lowering the human to the level of the robot. See, everybody has this idea that, the machine taking over, the computer, the robotics. Their plan is infinitely more subtle than that. They don't want to replace us with robots. They don't need to do that. They just simply lower our consciousness to the level of the automaton, and the job is already done after that. That's why in my work, you see, I'm not a journalist, and I'm not going to sit here and get into the ins and outs of implants and chipping and surveillance. There's a lot of fantastic speakers. The references are all over my websites. They will deal with that more daily headline material. My focus, as I said, is slightly different. Now, man has obviously been described as the thinking animal, but that's the problem. Animal, maybe tomorrow, thinking, maybe not. Curtis Schaeffer says the ultimate achievement of biocontrol may be the control of man himself. The controlled subject would never be permitted to think as individuals, A few months after, a surgeon would equip each child with a socket mounted under the scalp and electrodes reaching selected areas of brain tissue. The child's sensory perceptions and muscular activity could be modified or completely controlled by biometric signals radiating from state-controlled transmitters. They're not hiding it. Now, it's okay, I'm not faulting the fact that what we do can be determined by other people or by the world. What my issue is that it's who we are. As a person, as a self, that shouldn't be determined by anybody else but that self. Now that just sounds sort of meaningless, but it's actually incredibly important. Because what happens, well, it's even bad enough in what we do to be defined, because what happens if the world that's defining what we do is an abnormal world? We've only got a problem just even in the doing, acting, relationship world. But you can certainly call it a crisis when we have the world and other people determining who we are as a self, because the only entity that can determine what it is to be a self is the self itself. I know that in English doesn't come out right, but in German it's very much more interesting. We must, in other words, we must never allow ourselves as selves, right, to be determined by anything else but the self. However, and that's the point of being self-conscious. That's why we are self-conscious, to engage in that very process. But the thing is, it's not just as simple as that. It's if we don't do it, then they will. There's connections here between the master and the slave, and if you don't do it, say you abnegate that duty and say, it's too much trouble, well, they'll step in right away to do it. Rollo May, one of the premier existential psychologists, will be talking about that subject today, or this evening. In his fantastic book, The Meaning of Anxiety, he says that being, human being, to psychologists, the human doesn't mean much. That's for biologists and anthropologists and scientists. It's the being part that interests the psychologists and the philosophers, and it's what defines a person, not the human. That doesn't mean anything, that's just flesh and blood. Being is what you're here for. Well, he has something interesting to say. He says that being is a category which cannot be reduced to introjection of social and ethical norms. It is, to use Nietzsche's phrase, beyond good and evil. To the extent that my sense of existence is authentic, it is precisely not what others have told me I should be, but is one Archimedes point I have to stand on from which to judge what parents and other authorities demand. So he's not saying they are not going to demand. He's saying, yeah, they'll demand. But there's a dividing line. He goes on to say that the full meaning of the term human being will be clearer if the reader will keep in mind that being is a participle, a verb form, implying that someone is in the process of being something. It is unfortunate that when used as a general noun in English, the term being connotes a static substance, and when used as a particular noun, such as a being, it is usually assumed to refer to an entity, say, such as a soldier, to be counted as a unit. Therefore, becoming, the word becoming, connotes more accurately the meaning of the term in English countries. We can understand another human being only as we see what he is moving toward, what he is becoming. And we can know ourselves only as we project our potential into action. So, in other words, being is a bit difficult concept. It gives this idea of stasis, and it's hard to get the mind around what that is exactly. So that's semantics. Look, it's about a human being aspiring to be something. An active individual that thinks he thinks, that knows that he thinks, and he's heading towards something, is a vision of himself, something he wants to be and something he wants to create. George Simmel, the sociologist, he says the deepest problems of modern life flow from the attempt of the individual to maintain the independence and individuality of his existence against the sovereign powers of society, against the weight of the historical heritage and the external culture and technique of life. The antagonism represents the most modern form of the conflict which primitive man must carry on with nature for his own bodily existence. So what the primitive man had to fight, his focus of conflict, it's slightly different. That's been taken away, but we have other conflict. The conflict is now the one of the individual against society. The ancient man, it was him against nature. Now you're going to get that German lesson that you they certainly don't want. No, it's very brief, so the agony will be brief. And it basically has introduced 3 German terms which don't really translate well. That's why I have to harangue you in this way. And it's also to introduce this concept of an existential trinity, because it's to emphasize this fact that each of us, each man and woman, is actually 3 people in one. I mean, okay, if you're into Egyptology and I don't know what other mythologies and so on, you'll read about man being many selves, many souls, not one. It's an interesting concept. But sticking strictly with existential psychology as a hermeneutic, they really regard each of us as a 3-fold being. And of course, that number 3 has unbelievable sacred connotation, so I was attracted to it from that purpose, that the very number 3 has such an incredible significance. But the horror begins. The 3 terms that I want you to look into, we're going to discuss, is Umwelt, Welt meaning world. The Umwelt is the world we walk in every day. The world, nature. The world we didn't create and have very little effect on, actually. It's the world of nature. It's the world that we came into. We didn't create it, we came into it. So it's the biological world and the environment. Then we have the Mitwelt. Mit is German for with, or meet, being with. It's the with world. And that means people, basically. The world of other people, like us. We recognize other human beings. The philosopher Hegel went on endlessly about this, that what happens in your mind when you first register other people, okay, it might be the mother, but anyone in general that's different than you, not separate from you, not quartered to you. What goes through your mind when you see another human being completely distinct? And then the last one is Eigen, or Eigenwelt, the own world, the self world, the world of the self. And that involves a relationship not with other people or even the world so much, although I can never rule it out. It's the relationship primarily with the self. The thing to remember, of course, is that all of these welts are working at the same time. They're completely interlocking. We are 3 people in one, always, always, always. You can think of it as that famous Celtic Triskelis, the 3 interlocking circles in the normal way that they show it. But that's a little bit inaccurate because, of course, the world, the Umwelt, actually embraces us all. It has dominion, really. So I prefer this diagram, which is that the world and nature embraces the other 2 as opposed to 3 equal ones interlocking. But again, those are just metaphors. The fact that these 3 levels of existence exist, that there's 3 levels of humanness, implies that there's also 3 different kinds of relationship that go on simultaneously. It happens so fast and so continually that we don't even notice it. But the most important thing to emphasize about the first level of interaction, the first type of relationship with the Umwelt, with the world as is, with nature, is that we affect very little change on it. I know in our heads we think dropping atom bombs and polluting oceans changes nature to a very small extent and only on this planet, and we might find out that that can backfire pretty quick. But keeping all that aside, actually our relationship with the Umwelt is merely one of adjusting to it. It's the boss, she's the boss, right? We adjust to it. I have to be very clear about that. And one other point, of course, is that when we do interact with it, from that egoistic point of view that we think we're affecting change on the world by our skyscrapers and our smog and whatever it might be, it's almost entirely destructive. That needs to be noted because that will be key to what we're looking at a little bit later on. Because I'm saying it's destructive because once we start investigating the relationship we have with ourselves, we'll find out why it's destructive. But when I said adjust, I mean, here's one very crucial example of how we adjust to it, is simply time. That so-called 12-hour clock, the 24-hour day, the days of the week, all that nonsense that we subject children to is a complete fallacy. It doesn't exist. But what we do is we have to adjust to that periodicity that exists in nature. So that's one gross way of adjusting. But I mean, don't we adjust? The moment we come into this world, we're adjusting to the myriad demands of everyone around us. Mother, father, neighbor, brother, sister, the world. We're adjusting continually. We have very little effect on it, but we're adjusting to it. And if we had more time, as I said, one of the things we are compressing is I have to leave out this investigation of how time factors in, and I apologize for that if people are interested in that concept. Again, go to the references I'll mention at the end, because this thing about how there's a difference between psychic and external time is absolutely crucial to spiritual development, absolutely crucial. In the realm of the Mitwelt, it's a bit different because there we do actually affect true change. If I love you or I kill you, I've affected change on you, haven't I, and you and me. In fact, I have always gone so far as to say that not only does a sip of a single glass of water change me, and we only focus on, I've changed that, it's half what it was. Our mind almost never thinks about the change that a simple act of drinking a glass of water has had on you. But leaving that abstractly aside, bringing it back to the human level, a single glance at another human being passing on the bus changes that person. You may subconsciously register the shoes they're wearing, and next week you go out and buy exactly the same thing, which leads to, Rod Serling could spell it out for you. There's many programs of, many women have a genius of explaining exactly that bizarre Alfred Hitchcock chain of events from one small little thing. So we do affect change on other people in a very dramatic way, and they affect enormous change on us in the Mitwelt. You have to explore this level of frequency of effect that each individual has. And obviously when we say the word conformity, you've heard that a lot from people like myself, and we're always talking about the conformity and regimentation. When we're using words like that, it will be primarily addressing that level. It's the Mitwelt that we're talking about. The conformity is of that realm more than it is of the others. And it's because this world, commands so much unbelievable attention, and we have to subscribe to its mores so vastly. And yeah, okay, we know that the world changes us. I think the most important question that comes next is then how much? Nobody can deny that existence means that we're being changed constantly, but we would certainly want to question how much. And when we move to the next section a little bit later, we'll be exploring that. Because I'm worried that it changes us to such an extent that the we, the I, and the me that we think we are may be entirely a product of that influence and that effect. We might be a product. Our whole thinking may be colonized and dominated by the we, the us, and the our. I mean, it's needed to an extent, I'm not denying that, but we may be completely colonized by that. And then, of course, the next step is the global village, the post-humanists, who will tell you, you are what we say you are, no different than high school and all the other malarkey you have to go through, where you are literally being told that by somebody who, by the way, doesn't have a faintest idea who he is. That's a paradox. I've always found that remarkable. But those myriad demands never stop. And I think if you try to fight those myriad demands, you might be wasting your time. So I think that ask the question how much, realize that it's happening a lot, try to defend against it certainly, but don't put the entire focus there. The other focus is something mysterious is going on in ourselves behind all of that palaver. And that is that as you're changing constantly to all these demands, there's a you going through those changes that remains constant. Not true of psychotic people, who that law does not apply, or applies less. But talking about semi-normal people, not abnormal people, and I mean that in a textbook context, that person has an I that remains constant even through that change, implying that there's more than just the being that's changing, right? Let's just leave it at that for now. And in that Eigenwelt, that is where the real focus of a person should be, okay? Because you have almost no effect, except a topical one on the Umwelt. You have a problematic and almost entirely destructive relationship in the Umwelt and the Mitwelt. But where your main focus is, and where the full weight of your responsibility, your free will and your choice, your self-esteem, and also of your neurosis will be, is in the inner world. Neurosis meaning if you don't attend to it, or you attend to it incorrectly, then it'll be an aberrant or abnormal attention that you're giving yourself. And we'll look at that as we proceed as well. But when you talk about free will and choice, it's never ever entered my head that I don't identify with political action. I've never done that. When people say the word responsibility, free will, choice, self-esteem, and all of this, it's the Eigenwelt that I'm thinking about. All that other stuff is some other kind of comedy that goes by the name of, well, free choice, free will. Number 6. So again, just to emphasize something brilliant again about the Eigenwelt, one could spend hours on just these three concepts and how they interlock. We have so little time. But one important thing to bring out is that we not only have existence, we not only have that continual self that seems to be going through the experiences but yet remaining sovereign, shall we say. We are aware that we're doing it. We have awareness of what is happening. We're the one registering those changes. We're almost like a journal that's being written. In fact, Nietzsche made a point that all his life he felt that he was a pen being written by the will to power, or he felt that something was moving through him, that he was just a vessel for this other voice. And in many ways you could say that about a lot of people. And of course, we have that awareness, but here's even another incredibly amazing thing. We also have the free choice to turn it off. Now, that's good news and bad news. It means you actually have a thing called choice, but you could also misuse it. So I'm glad to hear we got the choice, but too many of the people go, well, okay, I don't want to be aware. I'm being amused and entertained. Can we do that later, While they hurry to their graves, as if they want to get there. Our whole society is rushing forward. 70 summers, 28,000 days, and they're running, we are running like madmen as if we're desperate to get there. I can't explain it. What this really means on a more mystical note is that man is the only being capable of transcendence. He stands outside the world, but he's also in that world, right? In other words, he nucleates the opposites. He nucleates duality. And he nucleates time. What this means on a philosophical note is that he is both the subject and the object, right? Subject just means the self, the viewer. And object is anything else in the world that you're looking at. This computer, this table, and the people around me are objects in psychological parlance. However, that perceiver, the subject, can also view his own body and think about himself. So he himself is an object of his own consciousness. Well, wait a minute. I thought there was duality. But if I can look at myself as an object, but I'm also the subject, then I've just nucleated the total illusion that there is such a thing as a subject-object dichotomy. And believe me, this has caused a lot of problems in the hundreds of years of philosophy. People have really been driving themselves crazy over that point. Again, we can't have time to really explore it, but it's a fascinating concept because you are a walking, transcendent being who can nucleate this duality anytime you want. But if you're waiting for the guru to do it and the priest, you'll have a long wait because you're the one who can do it. As we said, one of the ways that you do it is this concept of psychological or psychic time. That is not necessarily needs to be chained to the historical and the worldly time of getting up and going to work and all of these kinds of concepts. And the calendar, as we said, and the clock. You have an imagination. Now remember, in the Umwelt, that included, what do we say? Nature. So that means animals. And that's where animals differ from us. Because animals are chained to the Umwelt. They cannot change of their own free will. Their patterning, their chronologies, and so on. They're chained to that. We are not. We're actually separate from that. It's one of the unique things that makes us a being, is that we have another set of time. That whole concept of even moods changing your sense of time. She's late. Minutes seem like hours, right? Hey, we just had the greatest vacation. Shit, it went by really quick. I wish it would last longer. Or that great weekend went by fast. Well, wait a minute. Our moods affect time. It's just one anecdote showing you that time is different for the psyche of a human being than it is for history and for nature. Meaning you have power over it, and we'll look at that a little bit better. In fact, in my mystery school stuff where we deal with divination, that is central to the whole thing. For anyone who has a sort of wonder about that, what we're talking about here is part of that. Numerology, tarot, divination, astrology. This concept of your inner time is the whole nucleus of it. That's what we work with. That's what those arts are all about, is to work with that and improve that concept and your awareness of this inner chronology, this inner time, to free you from the enslavement of the other. But of course, what has this got to do with Big Brother and posthumanism, right? This talk is to try and introduce ourselves to some of the things that they know that we don't, or some of the tools that they're working with. And this brings up a very important area, which is mostly the province, granted, of psychologists, but we need to just grab their teachings and we need to become aware of it. We need to take some of that fantastic stuff they've been looking at and put it in, as I said, a new context, shift it around, look at it from a different angle. This question of anxiety becomes very important to how Big Brother's control works. Because it turns out that there's actually two kinds of anxiety. There's the anxiety of the self, the Eigenwelt, and there's the conflict that comes about when you try to interact with the Mitwelt, with other people. That creates stress, creates conflict, we know that. And then there's the inner one as well. Two kinds of conflict. In other words, we have anxiety from maintaining our selfhood and from not being overwhelmed by the other, okay? So there's a lot of stress when you have that defensiveness of going, enough already. You know, I want to listen to Motorhead, Mother, you know, bugger off, you know. When we have all that resistance, there's a great deal of stress in being ourselves and defending from being overwhelmed by the tribe and the hive mentality. However, the second kind is the kind of, I want to be accepted by the Mitwelt. I'm just not a full person until I'm adored by everybody and they feel good about me, right? So then we have anxiety from another side. Two important, totally distinct, unmarried forms of anxiety. One you could call neurotic, the one where you're not adjusting enough and you're not smart enough and cute enough and all of that. That is the neurotic form of anxiety, which is completely the bottom line when it comes to psychologists. That's the one they work with every day. And the existential psychologists work with the other one. The anxiety that comes when your selfhood is being overwhelmed. But that first kind of anxiety is actually, remember we said that there's something positive about anxiety? Legitimate anxiety? Let's explain that now. The anxiety of being born brought you into this life, so you can't unplug from that anxiety. All right, that means that there's a positive kind of anxiety. It attends births and deaths. Meaning, so what does that mean on an existential level? It means that what it means is you don't only experience one death. There's another lie. You experience countless lives and deaths. We know them as rites of passage. And that rite of passage, as all the ancients knew, is literally a movement from a life to a death, and then from a death to a new life. You do it constantly. And anxiety is attendant at that moment, because you've just died. And there should be anxiety with death. There always will be anxiety with death. And it's right that there is anxiety with death experience. This must be absolutely fundamentally grasped. You must make this your lover, because she's there with every birth and death. So the people who want to push it away from you and drug the shit out of you, they're up to something, and we're going to be looking at what they're doing. Because in those moments of great agony and ecstasy, the great crises of life, they're the rites of passage. And what's really happening, of course, we're not obviously talking a physical death. To make it more clear, it's a death in the way of seeing. The only way you can really explain it in the English language is a way of seeing is dying. It's either going to become really narrow, like most people's are, or suddenly it's something else. Like a gentleman outside was talking to me about this marvelous experience he had. Just one day, just like the guy in Network, he was filled with the prana, filled with the bioenergy. So the way of seeing can narrow, it can widen, and it will do it, both of them, constantly. It's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be both interlocking all the way through your life. And the anxiety that walks with that attends that, is never to be sedated. So what you're dealing with the posthumanists is simply this. Their main attack on you is not, their attack is, we know about their attack on the Umwelt. That's been chronicled by even mainstream scientists who know nothing about what we're talking about. The devastation they're doing to nature, the constant destructiveness and so on. Their attack is, again, to a certain level on the Mitwelt, our relationships with other people and so on. But they are far more preoccupied with the attack on the Eigenwelt, the attack on yourself, on the consciousness. That's it. Because remember, if they win there, the rest is automatic. That's their main focus. And you need to know about it, because if your defenses are in the wrong battlements, you're dead. You've got to know where to put the defenses. You've got to be out Rommel. Now, the neurotic, right, which is nothing more than the slave they're trying to make everyone into, how does he play into this? Well, he himself has emptied himself out to such an extent. He's obsessed with what's going on in the Umwelt. His entire life is the Umwelt. His entire life is the Mitwelt. He doesn't even know about the self. He's under-concerned about that. Even strictly, neurotics are completely obsessed by what's going on outside. We call them obsessive compulsives and paranoias and whatever. What it really means in a nutshell, without all the A technical palaver is a person who is completely outer directed. They're the wet dream of the controllers. Now, of course, what I'm saying is they're not going to tell you this. They're not going to admit that they're after your soul. They decorate that in a bunch of talismanic rhetoric about independence and freedom and diversity and individuality, all the talismanic words to really make you think that that's what they're doing, while they're actually attacking that head on. Expert on the subject of the very things we're talking about, the Russian philosopher Ayn Rand, she says, a collectivist tyranny dare not enslave a country by an outright confiscation of its values, whether they be material or moral. It has to be done by a process of internal corruption. Internal corruption. That has to be grasped. And by the way, when they're trying to do the external version, it's often a way to come in so that you don't even notice they're doing that. I'm sure everyone here understands that already. And this immersion into, another consequence of our immersion into that disastrous external world is basically the regression of civilization. The two go together. But she goes on to say that a social theory of ethics substitutes society for God. And although it claims that its chief concern is life on earth, it is not the life of man, not the life of the individual, but the life of a disembodied entity, the collective. I describe it basically as the second fall. I got a lot of trouble for writing this weird motto in the Atlantis book, and it was something like it said, some of the greatest myths have yet to happen. And people, what do you thought? That's meaningless. It's about to happen because this immersion in the Umwelt and also the plan to dehumanize the whole human race is basically, outside of a strict biblical connotation, is basically a fall. That's the way I look at it. And another thing to know about this death by anxiety concept is that a lot of the anxiety that you hear about, there's another level to the legitimacy of it, is of course it's bloody legitimate. You shouldn't be wanting to invest yourself in the lie, right? So the reactions that you have psychologically to doing something completely stupid and totally selfless, wouldn't you expect there to be some negative consequences? You've done something completely unorganic and unnatural. But the point I just made a few minutes ago about what they do out there to distract you from here, this, again, is the ruse. Because remember, if they can create a great deal of that external anxiety in the Umwelt and the Mitwelt, which they're doing daily, and they're doing it manufactured, we understand that point. But what's their point? What are they doing it for? Is because in our then need to say, I need alleviation for that, they bring in Big Pharma with the other hand. And what happens? When we're not noticing it, the baby goes out with the bathwater. They will alleviate, or we go to it just to be alleviated from all the three-headed monsters that the media is selling us, right? But in comes the other Leviathan, gives us the alleviation, the panacea, the bromide, and with it goes the positive anxiety. So in the first half of this presentation, what we've come so far is to realize that. That's what one area of their expertise is, to make so much topical pseudo-anxiety manufactured that we cry out for alleviation from it. Take their poison into our being to alleviate that topical, and one could argue that that's all right. But unfortunately, we do something unbeknownst to ourselves that also suppresses, that basically sabotages, subverts the actual positive anxiety that is the very hallmark of existence. Can't say enough about that. H.L. Mencken, the American writer, says that the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and thus clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. Arno Gruen called it the insanity of normality. That's what you're left with when the self isn't factored in. In fact, Mark Twain said, when we realize that the whole world is mad, all the mysteries of life stand explained. I got that up at the top 5 of my favorite quotes. Another expert on psychosis and neurosis, the great Scottish psychologist R.D. Laing, said that insanity is a perfectly natural adjustment to a totally unnatural and negative environment. from the alienated starting point of our pseudo-sanity, everything is equivocal. Our sanity is not true sanity. The madness, our madness, their madness is not true madness. Our normal adjusted state is too often the abdication of ecstasy, the betrayal of our true potentialities. That many of us are only too successful in acquiring a false self to adapt to false realities. Erich Fromm, a person we'll be reading from quite a lot, in his monumental book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, he says, in fact, it is the fully sane person who feels isolated in the insane society. And he may suffer so much from the incapacity to communicate that it is he who becomes psychotic. Talk about inside out, upside down, and back to front. And of course, he's quite right. Experts have gone to great lengths to show you that we even have a Leviathan out there to label you as mad the moment that you start seeing the light. Arno Gruen, American existentialist, psychologist, or post-Freudian, whatever you want to call it, says that the people who strike us as the most disturbed, the schizophrenics, are the most radical opponents of this type of identification. For they attempt to withdraw completely from our world, the false world, and they're regarded as dissociated. They won't have anything more to do with it. They go, I'm out of here, and they go out of here. That's why they have blank stares and look straight through you. They don't want to hear you. They're gone into their own world. So much for the world that you presented to them. Now, what's happening in the architecture of society we're going to see is that this global village is being built as a perfect resort for the psychotic. That's all it is. For that hyper-directed, hyper-outer-directed man. Everyone sane is the outsider, just by definition, by default. And whether you call them collectivists or communitarians or Prometheans or utopians or Luciferians, or as I do, atonists and so on, it really doesn't matter. Their construction is the ultimate closed society. It's the ultimate closed society. You're either in it or you're outside it. And I am definitely outside it because I do not want to be living those kinds of people. I've made up my mind. I don't want to be an inhabitant in that place. It's what might the sociologist Max Weber called the iron cage of bureaucracy. Does that sound familiar? Few implants. You won't notice a difference. But of course, again, it's hidden, isn't it? It's talismanic words. It's never going to be presented as that. They got billion-dollar PR, democracy, diversity, freedom, multiculturalism, brotherhood of man, civil society, utopia. Anything they'll call it, but hell that it is. And of course, great thinkers have all been predicting this from the earliest periods of time. Marcus Aurelius, this emperor of Rome, he said, the object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. But if you said that to somebody, they think you're barmy. It's all right for the emperors, they can handle it. Everybody bows and says, yes, sir, great wisdom. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the man whose ideology basically built the founding fathers of America, drew on. They were so inspired by this man. He said, to be sane is in a world of madmen. To be sane in a world of madmen is in itself madness. And Krishnamurti, the Indian teacher, he said, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And if that sick society is telling you what you are, you will be sick by default. And this is basically, as we said at the beginning, the tyranny, the problem that surrounds us, the problem that awaits. This is it. The global village is the summer camp, the wet dream for the psychotic person, the psychotic personality type. And then you're asking what to do about it. Well, one thing is that, as David R. Hawkins says, look, there is no antidepressant that will cure a depression that's spiritually based. That's the first thing, is to diagnose it correctly, right? For the malaise does not originate from brain dysfunction, as they're so desperate to tell you and spend billions trying to prove, but from an accurate response to the desecration of life. That means the Umwelt is desecrated, we're not denying that. The Mitwelt is in a state of total shambles, but that is paltry to compare to the inner landscape of the human being. That's the desecration he talks about. But wait a minute, just give them a chance. They're working on it. They're working on it. They're up to speed on this. They know that you're desperately fragmented and depressed, and very soon it'll all be over. In fact, Gruen, psychologists have to pick up the pieces of this every day, don't they? The good ones, they know what they're talking about. Many patients, says Gruen, enter therapy not in order to preserve their human feelings, which they perceive as a hindrance, but to be liberated from them. Like you take your These people go in for makeovers and all that kind of thing. It reminds me always of the Arthur Jensen barrage of information in the movie Network, where all necessities provided, all anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused. And basically I just summarize it by saying the anxiety-haunted man depends upon the handrails provided by society. He is the perfect citizen of the global village. He happily exchanges his name for a number and eagerly exchanges his sovereignty for security. And once you're inclined to do that, they're happy to oblige. Because these people have gone ahead of you. They're more psychotic than you'll ever be. As Jung said, we have lost our superstitious fear of evil spirits and things that go bump in the night, but instead are seized with terror of people who, possessed by demons, perpetrate the frightful deeds of darkness. That the doers of such deeds think of themselves not as possessed, but as supermen, does not alter the fact of their possession. They get their power from our complicity. They wouldn't have it without our falling to our knees. David Icke said, what's his latest motto? Humanity, get off your knees. If you don't, they sit back and the job is done for them. If you leave rotten meat out, expect maggots. These are the people who hold civilization back. Sigmund Freud explains it this way. He says, if the development of civilization has such far-reaching similarity to the development of the individual, right? Mitwelt, Umwelt, Eigenwelt, they're all connected. Then, and if it employs the same methods, may we not be justified in reaching the diagnosis that under the influence of cultural urges, some civilizations, possibly the whole of mankind, have become neurotic? He believed it had. That's why there's a campaign of disinformation, the likes of which you've never seen on Freud, by the way. And the tools of the trade are not difficult to understand. I've gone into it umpteen times. It's simply hierarchy, control, and enslavement with your complicity. But of course, let's never forget that their global village is obviously artificial. It's artificial from the ground up. It's an artificial simulacra of reality. It's not reality. It's a simulacra or a... So Ayn Rand says that we are fast approaching the stage of the ultimate inversion. I said I couldn't explain it, but she does a better job. The stage where the government is free to do anything it pleases while the citizens may act only by permission, which is the stage of the darkest periods of human history, the stage of rule by brute force. And it's not just, as I said, permission to speak, sir, it's permission to think. Nathaniel Brandon, her protege, he says, if it is a virtue to renounce one's mind, but a sin to use it, if it is a virtue to approximate the mental state of a schizophrenic, but a sin to be an intellectual focus, if it is a virtue to denounce this earth, but a sin to make it livable, if it is a virtue to mortify the flesh, but a sin to work and act, and if it is a virtue to despise life, but a sin to sustain and enjoy it, then no self-esteem or control or efficacy are possible to man. Nothing is possible to him but the guilt and terror of a wretch caught in a nightmare universe. We talked about the two kinds of anxieties. We didn't mention that reality, the two forms of anxiety, also breed two modes of escape. Because, of course, you can't have anxiety without wanting rid of it, right? And they're very easy to grasp. In fact, you could divide humanity in these categories. One mode of escape is the chronic withdrawal. You just completely disassociate. The worst case, the worst version of that is what we know as schizophrenia. Then there's the opposite, the outer directedness, the extroversion and the immersion in the mass. Both serve the same purpose, you see. And it's mania and neurosis that is mostly identified with the second version. Rand says that for the rational, psychologically healthy man, the desire for pleasure is the desire to celebrate his control over reality. For the neurotic, the desire for pleasure is the desire to escape reality. So it's pleasure and extinction, if that makes any sense at all. And by the way, she is mentioning pleasure. Don't we know how hard it is to break a habit that's pleasurable? Almost impossible. So if in fact she's right and it becomes a pleasure and extinction, who's going to break it? Is it even possible to break it? Jerry Mander, he says that self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction. Right? Humanity can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. I mean, that sounds bizarre, but that's how masochistic things have become. But I want to emphasize again, stop thinking in terms of external cataclysms and apocalypse. What they're talking about here is what the Hopi describes as koyanets katsi, the change in the way of seeing, the change in the inner landscape. That might then affect, in the way that Wilhelm Reich so brilliantly explained, might affect changes outside, but the psyche is where it's happening first. That's the threat that awaits. Brandon says, one of the hallmarks of the man who lacks self-esteem is the fact that most of his pleasures are pleasures of escape from the two pursuers whom he has betrayed and from whom there is no escape, reality and his own mind. They used to be on good terms once upon a time. Probably the most eminent leading expert in the study of neurosis was Karen Horney, German psychologist. He says that there is scarcely any neurosis in which the tendency to get rid of the self does not appear in direct form. It may appear in fantasies of leaving home or becoming a derelict or of losing one's identity. Fantasy, she means the dreams. The tendency is present in wishes to be hypnotized, in an inclination towards mysticism, in feelings of unreality. In an inordinate need for sleep, in the lure of sickness, insanity, death. In masochistic fantasies, the common denominator is a feeling of being putty in the master's hands, of being devoid of will, of all power, of being absolutely subjected to another's domination. So the anxiety, the wrong kind of anxiety, the neurotic anxiety, leads you straight into the hands of Big Brother. They don't even have to do anything. Now, when it comes to this escape from the self, well, I mean, we're experts. We would put Houdini on the dole. We are absolutely phenomenal at it. How do we do it? A couple of guesses. It's called work. It's called that getting up in the morning and going, the immersion in the work, the immersion in the domestic minutiae. It's actually so obvious that we often don't even realize it when we're doing it. Or the rat race, trying to be the biggest rat. It's coma by affluence. Many have said that affluence is the worst bromide of all. And this immersion has been successful. Eric Fromm says, what has happened in modern industrial society is that traditions and common values and genuine social personal ties with others have largely disappeared. The modern mass man is isolated and lonely, even though he is part of a crowd. He has no convictions which he could share with others, only slogans and ideologies he gets from the communications media. Matthew, could you remind me how much time we've got? Just up the side of the stage, will be fine, thanks. The obvious one, needs no introduction, is simply addiction. That'll do the trick. It's very common. Addiction is the #1 health problem in America today. Many people feel the addiction is also at the root of other problems such as crime, poverty, divorce, child abuse, and other forms of violence. Others argue that it is these problems that lead to addiction. Religion, have to say it, serves the same purpose. We could explore that. I've done endless work on that, so I don't really need to say more, except that there's always some hobgoblin in the sky to help, the infantile ego pacify that. And we had that. Remember, it's only a flash in the pan ago that the king existed, and the king told you what to do. You just obeyed the king like you obeyed Jehovah. You didn't think. He rewarded you when you did what he wanted, and he took care of all the problems. Historically, that's a second ago. There's always some Zeus out there. Let's see. Theodor Reich, the great psychologist, he says, to the primitive mind, all evil comes from outside. Famine, death, and illness are the result of some malicious sorcerer or demon. The world is full of evil demons. And the gods have to be propitiated since they too want to harm the poor human beings, you see. It's the throwing out of the control that you should actually have within yourself. And just a little note on the collectivism. The whole point of, again, a focus when you study the religious, if you're new to this, is look at the ubiquitous collectivism, whether it's East or West versions, where the self is almost thrown aside. Or you have a more gimmicky New Age version of it, slowly hypnotizing you with words that mean truth. The words are true. The words are true. but what's behind it? You know, trying to seduce you into that one-seasoned world. The total Svengali approach, you know. It's unbelievable to watch it. Or just look, you know, I've had it. Can't deal with it, out I go. Rebel against it in some more primitive way. Understandable. We've all done it. Doesn't work. Or, as we've been pointing out time and time again so far, we just give up and say, look, I can't do it at all mentally. I'll just go along with the flow and do as others do and not think about it at all. If they want to have national fantasies going around like community and utopia and goodness and equality and all of that, I'm for that. Just show me where to put my X. So, we talked about the mud is being prepared that's going to make the bricks that build the global village, but of course we have to understand it's not actual physical mud. The ingredients, as I said before, are more subtle, and we have to discover what those ingredients are. Collectivism is one ingredient, but this whole thing that's coming about, this whole post-humanism, has many ingredients, and they all have to be sampled, and they all have to be tasted, and tracked back to their origins. Because again, to summarize the point, there's two ways of being eaten. Have some beast pursue you and grab you in its jaws, or alternatively, it doesn't need to move an inch and you sail right into its jaws of your own free will. Which one's more deadly and demonic? You know, it's up to you to choose. But see, I must confess one thing, and that is personally, from my limited observation of human life, I've never taken it for granted that people want freedom. Maybe there's something wrong with me, but I have not seen enough proof of that. Changing chains of iron for chains of gold, I've seen that. Changing, I'm uncomfortably numb for, can I be comfortably numb? I've seen that. But the striving for absolute freedom, very few, and they're the mad, remember? Never forget that, they're the crazy ones. Where did they end up? Esther Villar says, look, freedom is the last thing he wants. He functions according to the principle of pleasure and non-freedom. He wants to be sentenced to lifelong freedom is worse of a fate than lifelong slavery. To put it another way, a man is always searching for someone and something to enslave him, for only as a slave does he feel secure. Gustave Le Bon, a fantastic writer, wrote one of the seminal books on this problem called The Crowd. He says, the masses have never thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusion is always their victim. Matthew, how much time do we have?
Got an hour and 20 minutes.
Okay.
You can shout with Paul.
Yeah, sure. So back to one of the main themes. The threat that awaits, the threat that awakens is, look, I said this in one other talk last year. It was Age of Manipulation Part 1. I'll say it again now. And are we doing this because we will literally accept chains of gold, immersion in the collective, abnegating the self, because we're too frightened to walk the Siddhartha road? We just have made an inward decision that, nope, can't do that, can't do any of that shadow work, too difficult. We don't want to awaken the spirit of rebellion because, for two reasons. Freedom, spirit of rebellion, doesn't just mean that you don't want somebody over you. I mean, that should be almost obvious. We don't really, obviously, part of our mind doesn't want some tyrant over us. But you see, it goes deeper than that. You might be successful in getting people, we do this in the work life, we might actually be successful in getting so much promotion up the hierarchy that we, in fact, do not have anyone really overseeing us, right? No overseer. That's not true freedom. Because, see, from the existential point of view, you might have just set yourself up as a tyrant and be satisfied with people under you, which is no change at all. As William Blake said, the tyrant, the fist that crushes the tyrant's head becomes a tyrant in its stead. So the true freedom, the true existential freedom, the true walking the Siddhartha road is you get rid of any bosses and big honchos above you if you can manage it. But you don't set yourself up in a place as another one, because then nothing has actually changed. No master above, no slave below. That's the thing that's rarely ever said. Arno Gruen says that, look, we want to escape responsibility because we are deeply afraid of having a self of our own. It's not an abstract responsibility that we find threatening, but rather the responsibility to realize ourselves. That's frightening to us. We're talking about spirit of rebellion. We got plenty of rebellion. We got rebellion for dummies. We got the beginner's guide. That's to the spirit of rebellion. We're in the earliest stages. We got the rebel without a cause. We got the Bono version. The metro sexy chic version, all right? We're doing really great there. But who are these people? These are the vicars and high priests of the global village. They only want to present you with the change in the Umwelt. And even if they're successful, it's okay, give them a medal. Gruen puts it so succinctly. He says, look, we would rather forgive the evil proliferating around us than the rebellion, he says that we would rather forgive the evil proliferating all around us than the rebellion against it, which we mistake for the true evil. I mean, that's a fantastic statement. So we have the chic, trendy television version, and the high priests are always everywhere giving us that save the world, brotherhood, and all that talismanic mumbo-jumbo. But on a more positive note, you're still here, Jesus, after that. On a more positive note, we do in fact find ourselves in a very interesting age. I've gone into this in other work, as you know. We are in an age of answers. I predicted it in the Atlantis book. There is room for good news. I said in that book that, in the next 10 years, and we're at that point right now, we will have the mysteries to the whole of all the great questions. We will have that. We will have them. But it requires that we first ask the right questions, that we have the guts to accept the answers, because any fool can ask the question. It takes a lot of guts to accept the answer, and even more than that, you must want the answers at any personal cost. The Irish politician Bernadette Devlin said, in order to gain what is truly needed and meaningful, you may have to lose everything else. So you must not only say, well, I want the answers, but as soon as you find out what it'll take, what sweat you'll have to go through to get those answers, and you cop out, well, that's useless. And finally, you must have this other ingredient. It's basically equivalent to the spirit of rebellion, and that is zero tolerance for the lie. And that means more than what it looks like, because you have to have discernment. You're going to have to do some homework at that point. So those four qualities are also very much required in this process. But since we're on the subject of 2012, one thing I will say is, look, when we say it's the end of history, it's not going to be the end of the world. I've never said that, I don't subscribe to that, and I can't understand why people keep on going on about that. It's the end of consciousness, it's the end of a kind of thinking, it's the birth of human 2.0. That's what it's all about. Where existence, as we said, existence as we know it literally becomes illegal. Permission to think? No. What happens if the answer is no? When Sergeant Major says not only is there no permission to speak, but when you even ask for permission to think, and the answer turns out to be no, then what? That's where we're heading. Or another concept is to be so stressed from trying to be an outsider that you bang on the doors of the global village, let me in. This is another tactic that they use. And I say here that the war of attrition concerns the gradual movement toward the voluntary relinquishment of freedom. Right? It's David Icke's famous totalitarian tiptoe. Stage by stage, step by step, our masters remove the beingness from the human until humans are so collectivized and alienated that their own existence is of secondary importance to them than the existence of the hive in which they serve. In other words, remember we talked about the original positive kind of stress? That can also work against you, because in the end, and the masters are working on this, they're very clever to make it so impossible for you to do that, literally so impossible for you to rebel, because the alienation and the frustration and the depression and the loss and the material suffering and the fighting and the cajoling, and at one point a lot of us just can't take it. And we will then go, where's the cage? And you'll run into it and slam the door behind you without the Leviathan even having to move, you see. You see this going on all the time. It's basically psychic extinction. And it's not new. It's been predicted by some of the greatest minds that ever lived. Sigmund Freud addressed it brilliantly, I think. And he referred to this thing called the death instinct, the Greek thanatos. And Erich Fromm's term for it was necrophilia. It's actually the more correct. What we think that means is actually very, very stupid. The word actually means love of death in a very profound context. But the death instinct is Freud's take on it. Lots and lots of books have been written on this, some of them good, some of them not good. What Freud himself said is that starting from speculations on the beginning of life and from biological parallels, I drew the conclusion that besides the instinct to preserve living substance, there must exist another contrary instinct seeking to dissolve those units and bring them back to their primeval inorganic state. That is to say, as well as eros, there was also an instinct for death. And people think that Freud didn't do enough to really explain it. Oh yeah, well, he may have not done that, but the existentialists did, particularly two gentlemen, Otto Rank and Ludwig Binswanger, and Binswanger being the primal, one of the most senior and eminent existential psychologists. They did. And their take on it I can explain very simply. Immersion in the collective. They didn't say it was some instinct, as Freud sort of thought in more abstract terms. They said, look, the death instinct is simply the abnegation of your selfhood when you join that mass, that hive. That's it. That's Freud's death instinct. In the workable way that you can see it happening. When man plunges into the hive, says, where's my chains of gold? Tell me what to do. Don't bother me with anything to do with selfhood. Right? And that is the trend. That very trend, that very death, that morbidity is what we're seeing. That is the trend to come. We're already seeing it. You'd have to be stark raving mad and blind not to see it. Of course, what Freud is really talking about there in his concepts of this, remember he said in that quote that civilization and human beings can be compared, they could be both neurotic. He's emphasizing, well, he's actually not emphasizing, but the underlying point he's making there is the connection between physical and psychic energy. I really want to make this very emphatic. All good psychologists should be studying that. We all should be studying it. The intimate connections that the ancients were fully conversant with. And guess who else is fully conversant with it? It's not only a central question, but if you again negate it and you say, I don't want to know about that, I'm not going to study it, I couldn't care less about it, and you don't want to do your Piggy Malone and study it and track this beast, your masters, just know one thing then, hear it from me today, your masters know all about it. That's why they are masters. That's why they are the Luciferians, the illuminated ones, the princes of light. They understand those connections intimately, and they misuse it on a daily basis. That's how they gain their power. So, we should be up to speed on it. But in short, ignorance is the key. Ignorance is the way that they gain their greatest power. The great South African revolutionary Steve Biko, who was beaten to death in a prison cell, he said, the most powerful tool in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. He had it down. I've always spoken of it as a war of consciousness. It's ultimately a psychic tyranny. However, it's a psychic war, a war on consciousness, where we serve as double agents in the sabotage of ourselves. That's a bloody good job if you can get it. Who recruited you to do that? They use that checkerboard, said it time and time again. You can occupy the white squares of wisdom and knowledge and understanding, or the black squares of total ignorance. That beast out there, that Illuminati, is the product of our ignorance. They're on the white squares. They occupy them because we don't. As Plato said, it is better to be unborn than untaught, since ignorance is the origin, the root of all misfortune. But Schopenhauer puts it so bluntly, man would sooner die than think. It's very curious that the universality of an opinion should have so much weight with people, as their own experience might tell them that its acceptance is entirely thoughtless and merely an imitative process, but it tells them nothing of the kind, because they possess no self-knowledge whatsoever. He's addressing what? The Eigenwelt. Doesn't matter what your opinions and your politics and your little running around in the other worlds. That's important, sure, but it's not important to the deepest mind and the deepest thinkers. That comes and it goes. Rand says that psychologically the choice to think or not is the choice to focus or not. Existentially, the choice is to focus or not is the choice to be conscious or not. Metaphysically, the choice to be conscious or not is the choice of life and death. It's simply that. We're in an age of answers. What is the American philosopher Vernon Howard said? His answer was, look, that human sickness is so severe that few can bear to look at it, but those who do will become well. That's what we need to be doing. We have to have the guts and the zero tolerance. We must look and investigate, find out, get on the trail. But you see, in the cacophony of the external noise, all of that cacophony of the stimuli of the world, the greatest questions that we're talking about here and now never even get heard, let alone spoken about and answered, because there's noise out there, white noise, incredible barrage of it. the daily minutiae. You have to create a space that already you can silence that in some shape or form. And there's no A to Z methodology of doing it. But until the false is seen as false, the truth is not. And the only trouble is that those very critical skills of which I'm talking, they're being drummed out of kids. We may have some smattering of it, but look at the people today, the youth today, they don't even have the very skills we're talking about that's necessary to work all of this out. Not only that, they have a very limited sense of selfhood. We're talking about how evil comes about, the anatomy of it. That's what needs to be studied. Use the critical skill to discover what evil is, what its nature is, how it works, why it exists. Swallow the Lubitsch, he says that man is perfect at his origin, a divine being who is degenerated into what we are. Gerald Massey says that primitive man was not 100th part so likely to be the victim of hallucinations or diseased subjectivity as a modern man. And Jung, talking about the growth of civilization, says, I'm not denying that great gains have resulted from the evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent we can scarcely begin to estimate. A couple of summarizing slides here to bring together what we've been speaking about, and a little bit covering my work from the point go, is the concept of ancestral trauma, which is the root of this. If we have time, we'll explore more on that, but I just want to make the point that it is co-opted by the tyrants. The tyrants are aware of the pre-Diluvian, prehistorical trauma. They know what the real root of pathology is, and it's central to their activities. They try to hide the fact, that's why they put ice ages and every other kind of thing in the way, so that you don't even know how long the human race has been here, all that cataclysm. They don't want you to know about it, and I've done a wondrous job of disguising it from us, because to hide this very point. They don't want us to know about the primal trauma, because once you have found that one thread and pull it, it becomes a rope, which becomes a chain, and the next thing you know, you got a whale in your living room. They don't want us to have that whale in the living room to find out where that thread leads. Secondly, we're talking about the fragmentation of consciousness, the schizoid person creating the schizogenic society, and then the schizogenic society affecting the new children who come in and making them schizoid. It's a feedback loop. One of the most important symptoms of it is the creation of the false self, the pseudo-self. If you don't want your own self, you are capable of manufacturing a thing called an idealized self. This is what Karen Horney calls it. First it starts with an idealized image, and then that actually becomes the idealized self. I refer to it as the pseudo-self, which implies, obviously, the rejection of selfhood. And once you've done that, that means that you've chosen an inauthentic as opposed to an authentic form of life. And then following from that is the plunge into the ubiquitous collectivism that is growing more and more and more, the ultimate version of that being this post-human global utopia that we're talking about, and the orgy of self-sacrifice. But again, that trauma is it's the root of all the other cocktails of disorder, right? All the other pathologies, be they primal guilt or shame or whatever it might be. We've discussed the problem of anxiety, that it's two forms, right? Positive and negative. I think that's crucial. I don't think we're going to have time to get into self-hate, which is disorder number one. That's a crucial part of it. We may have to skip that. There's dependency, which we're all familiar with, of course, the chronic need for approval. Another one of those hydrous heads that seem to bother people so much. And then this very well-known to psychologists concept, the avoidance of legitimate suffering, the work of the shadow self. Remember I said fall in love with that anxiety? All those dark guardians that are trying to tell you what's really going on in your soul, that you go, no, that's all unconscious, that's all dark emotions, that's depression, and we give it all these horrible names. Anger, violence. We come up with some really good names for these things so that they can be, escorted out the side door to the servant's entrance. We're going to pay for that. Fragmented man isn't going to make anything whole. We mentioned the trauma. One subset of that is a thing called the historical amnesia, as we said, a huge ingredient. We're talking about the ingredients of tyranny, right? Remember that? Well, we've spoken about anxiety and some of the other ones. This one is important to note as well. The fact that we don't remember the past. And that the architects rely heavily on that fact. Let me just make a point about the trauma I'm talking about. It makes the Battle of the Somme look like a field day, like kids playing toy soldiers. It makes the tsunami in Japan or some other volcanic eruption look trivial. The trauma of the cataclysm that happened, some say 10,000 years ago, 13, 50, whatever it is, that prehistorical cataclysm, physical I'm talking about, was so unbelievably devastating to human consciousness. The only way you could understand it is being subjected to such an immense physical trauma yourself. Some of you here have probably been in situations like that, so you know what we're talking about. The complete and utter devastation of your own mind. But we're talking about a collective example. A family member dies in a horrible way, a personal tragedy. It's that magnified many times is what we're talking about. It has such a devastating effect, and it's a very short time historically. We're in a very early stage of it. But I will say this, that even if you have problems with my concepts of the genetic interference, which I factor in as being a co-part of that anxiety, and that stress that destroyed the ancestral consciousness, say you don't even buy into any of that alien stuff or genetics and interference, let us just agree, and we have to agree on that because the science is in, I'm afraid. The science is there, it's there, it can't be negated anymore, about the actual physical cataclysm. So even if we leave out the one side, we still admit that a trauma took place. Even the experts are crawling towards this revelation at this point, that yes, there was some devastating prehistorical event. Then I say, what is the effect on human consciousness then? Now, Theodore Reich says that Joseph Feldman comes thus to the conclusion that at the foundation of those oldest traditions, there must have been some historical event that left deep traces in the memory of all people. But what did it do? We're talking about, oh, it fragmented us, What did it do is a story that is just unbelievable. And this amnesia we're also talking about isn't difficult to achieve because we do it. We don't want to remember. That thing that we throw into the shadow world is done because we don't want to remember. I never want to see that again. Goodbye. It's like take it out. I've thrown it away. We dimmed the light. We chucked it out in the garbage. And we do not want to see it again. We forget and we forgot. That is, we forget something and then we forget we forgot it. That is the definition of repression. You forget something and then forget that you forgot it. What that means in strict psychological language is that we created the unconscious. The unconscious is the dumping ground. The memory and the door is bolted and shut. Now, it doesn't mean the stuff doesn't permeate, and through certain remarkable individuals, that content, and even in our dreams, and so I wouldn't say that content doesn't spill over in its own mysterious, magical way, but we're not talking about that. We're talking just about the simple sectioning off of a vast amount of our own consciousness for a bloody reason that psychologists have simply not addressed. Or they address it in ways that I don't think are that relevant, really. That's a shadow world, and we've junked the memory of the trauma. But we may have junked the memory of the trauma, we cannot junk the effects of the trauma. Those are raw. Every single human being is affected by it. Junking the memory of it, that only serves to an extent. Its effects are rampant through our lives. Carl Jung says that modern man does not understand how much his rationalism has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He's freed himself from superstition, or so he believes. But in the process, he has lost his spiritual values to a positively dangerous degree. His moral and spiritual tradition has disintegrated, and he's now paying the price for this breakup in a worldwide disorientation and disassociation. Oh, that's a vastly important quote here from Jung. Inasmuch as the ego is the center of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche, being merely a complex among other complexes. Hence, I discriminate, he says, between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my totality. Hence, it also includes the unconscious psyche. In this sense, the self would be an ideal factor which embraces and includes the ego. It's basically summarizing it there. The shattering of the mind that took place was a schizophrenic act. We're all schizophrenic. And the term was actually coined by Eugene Bleuler and simply means shattered or divided mind. That's why we have duality. That explains why we have illusion and reality, higher and lower, inner and outer, conscious and unconscious, and all the rest of it. Male and female. All our perception is dual, right? Because our minds are dualistic. then we need to explain. We have to have an explanation, right? A coloring book version, an explanation of, well, what's that all about? And we come up with this. We come up with some ridiculous, unsustainable gibberish to explain the situation. And you know, you just wait for centuries to pass until people realize it's unsustainable, if they ever, in fact, do. Or then they replace one with the other. But this ego that is now the center of waking consciousness, I've described as the ghost that rose from the grave of the self, basically. And that ego just loves disorder. It loves troubleshooting. It's a brilliant ego, and we must thank it for what it's done, but boy, oh boy, it's a manufacturer of unbelievable chaos. Creating division and, you know, fabricating dualisms and catching us in continually, you know, when people try to meditate, they say the noise of the mind. Welcome to the realm of the ego. 5 minutes before you get slammed by a truck, you're thinking, did I leave the iron on? Or it's actually happened. You're lying there in a coma, you've only got a head left, and you're thinking, you know, did I pay the bills? You know, did I empty the garbage? You know? It's unbelievable. Did I take those library books back? Again, this is another huge one for people. Write this one down. I mean, the trauma happened a short time ago, so we are babes in history. You'll see if we get to the point where we see there's positive and negatives as well. This is also one of the causes for optimism, by the way. The fact that we are so young historically in terms of this has both bad and good news attached to it. Okay, let's go, because we need to spend as much time as possible on this last section. Basically, the trauma, as we said, was alleviated by the splitting of consciousness. That division between the conscious and the unconscious mind, actually, we can understand it. It saved consciousness. The ego is the savior. That's why it acts in the preposterous and presumptive ways that the ego acts. It goes, listen, bugger, I saved you, your ass. There wouldn't be any consciousness at all without me, so give me my dues and my medals. You know? It's just like you remember that Charlie Chaplin movie where there's Mussolini and Hitler and they're jacking up their chairs to see which one's higher than the other and a chest full of medals? The ego wants its due because it held whatever was left of consciousness. It did the sectioning off. It created the dikes that was to partition consciousness. Doing that has caused untold human problems, existential problems. But by not doing it, we may not even have any waking consciousness at all. We may be groveling around like some troglodytes. Now, I can tell you some people who are already doing that. So this divisioning, right, the sectioning was very needed. That's important to recognize. But what we want to do, starting this next section, the final section, is that introduce to a word, probably the most magical word in the human language, probably the greatest word in the human language. A word that I don't think we've ever really grasped the beauty of it. We touched on it earlier, that we have capacities in the Eigenwelt, we have capacities that absolutely are different than the animals and what we see in nature. The ability to transcend, the ability to transmute. And imagination is a word that really refers directly to your inner reality, the totality of it. Anything going on in the mind, including that which is the ego. Don't think of it being all imagination as this other fantasy dream state. Imagination is the whole operation of your mind. All that's going on. Remember, if you actually think about it, we talked about that there was 2 anxieties and 2 selves and all of that. There's a speaker and a thinker. When you have that inner dialogue with yourself, you're listening to yourself. So there is a speaker and there is a thinker within your head. So, and the interaction between these 2 selves, so to speak, is very interesting. It's a dialogue that goes on all the time. Now, we're so familiar when I'm talking to you and you're talking to me, there's an exchange, isn't it? How have we always avoided the fact, some people have never even thought about it, that there's an actual exact duplicate going on in the head of an individual? Even a psychotic individual. In fact, the psychotics, manics, schizophrenics, that dialogue is so loud in their head, right, that the other speaker That's what the problem with schizophrenia is. They think they're hearing voices. It's them doing the talking. But they've so disassociated themselves in a fascinating way I wish we could explore. But they have so disassociated those two voices for a plethora of reasons, by the way, which I'll be dealing in other work what those are. But they imagine that other voice, or even at the end of the day, all the voices that are in their head, they imagine they're being possessed. When it's their own voices speaking, their own dialogue. When you study what schizophrenics experience, you understand 100%, when you skew it to the positive side, that we are not one self. Now, that inner reality we're talking about, imagination, exists within you whether you like it or not, or even whether you use it or not. It even exists in the minds of the most destructive people. In fact, one would say they have a very vivid, if warped, imagination, right? So even a destructive person can't get rid of it. Yet we rarely marvel or rarely cherish this feature, this property of human life. And more importantly than even that, is that just in the same way that we can decorate and beautify, and most decent, normal people want to do this, decorate the external world, right? And make it beautiful, there is also the concept of inner beauty. Because the landscape of a mind, as we know, can be ugly. Devastatingly ugly. Although you may, fall for the camouflage that destructive people present to you. But the inner landscape can also be a beautiful landscape as well. The imagination can do that. But just again, very, very simply, to say it very simply, is like a stone can't imagine what it's like to be a man. But you can imagine what it's like to be a stone. You can pluck an eagle out of the sky. You can ride a winged horse across the sky. You can be deep sea diving up in the wastes of the Arctic if you want to be, right? Fighting all sorts of wars, all in an instant. Just the simple act of getting on a normal horse and riding it, you can do it in an instant. As I'm saying this, you're thinking about doing it. The same act as saying, can you bring a horse in front of me, saddle it up, find me a field, and I'll get on and ride it, takes time, space, distance, and speed. Right? If this action actually happened, if we did an experiment, obviously it would take time to do so. But when you think about it, in your imagination, it happened instantly. That's what I'm talking about. We do it all the time and never even think of the unbelievable marvel of that. And the men who have thought about it are the great minds of our world, who actually never stop thinking about that fact. And we should not stop thinking about it, because this capacity is unbelievable. Not just to paint art and create music, to be in our own world, to decorate the Eigenwelt, to be a self. It's marvelous. Nietzsche went and said, look, we don't create thoughts. Thoughts come to us. From where? We don't create them, they just appear. Then we act on them, of course, we act on our thoughts, but the thoughts themselves, we don't sit there and go, today I'm going to have a thought about this. No, it doesn't work like that. So in a way, it's almost paradoxical and rather ludicrous to say, I think. And the champion of imagination was none other than the English painter and poet William Blake. He said, in your own bosom you bear your heaven and earth, and all you behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your imagination, of which the world of mortality is but a shadow. Even the church father Origen, he says, you yourself are another little world, and have within you the sun and the moon, and also the stars. Blake says, the eternal body of man is the imagination. He says, the imagination rises from the mind's abyss and seeks more expanded senses than the 5 making up that abyss. They've now discovered biologically there's 37 sensory inputs to the brain. We use 5. D.W. Winnicott, the American psychologist, says, can you see the one essential way in which science and intuition contrast with each other? That true intuition can reach to something while reach to truth in a flash, whereas in science the whole truth is never reached. The Greek philosopher, one of the greatest of all philosophers, can't even describe how many ideas this man pre-accused. Heraclitus, and I mean key ideas that bloody matter. He says, you could not reach the ends of the psyche, though you went the whole way. So deep is its nature. So he's telling us it's deep. You couldn't get to the bottom. Freud, he says the decisive rules of logic don't apply in the unconscious. We could call it the empire of the illogical. Now, people go, well, wait a minute. Now you're getting very mystical here, Michael, very abstract. You know, there's no such proof for any of this nonsense. You can't see thoughts and all that. There's no such thing in reality. It's just epiphenomena of the body and all that. Well, they're wrong. Because as a matter of fact, people further up the totem pole than all these physicalists, these Richard Dawkins, much as I love a lot of their work, and Daniel Dennett and these other people who are high priests of this physicalism, there is actually the proof. They just don't tell you that they know about it or avoid it. And again, the proof comes from the psychologist, you see. Now, experts may differ about the content of the unconscious. In fact, they do. But this term, the hidden observer, which was coined by a psychologist called Ernest Hilgard, it's very akin to the ancestral mind. And this is a completely scientifically oriented individual, and so was his team. I mean, I think they were actually even involved with the SRI in California. So there's a very, very mainstream physicists and biologists who discovered what we're going to look at right now when we explore this concept of the hidden observer. But again, it was preempted. Let's make sure that they can't cop the credit, you know, for discoveries. Listen, it's far older. Leibniz said, "It is a great source of error to believe that there's no perception in the soul besides those of which it is conscious." Freud himself says, "Nothing can be brought to an end in the unconscious. Nothing is past or forgotten." Nothing is past and forgotten. We've only talked about one thing that's not past and forgotten. Remember the trauma? Yeah, the memory of it is certainly forgotten, but the effects can never be forgotten. Robert Temple, in his book Open to Suggestion, he says, "The beginnings of the concept of dissociation are commonly attributed to Pierre Janet in 1889. Janet's interpretation is that systems of ideas are split off from the major personality and exist as subordinate personality, unconscious, but capable of becoming represented in consciousness through hypnosis. Janet was the first to introduce the term subconscious to refer to a level of cognitive functioning out of awareness that could on occasion become conscious." So they came up with subconscious, right? Unconscious, subconscious, because there's something going on in our minds. There's an embargo and apartheid in the mind of man. One of the greatest early and largely unknown pioneers of psychoanalysis was Georges Grodek. He was onto this from point go. That's why you probably don't hear about him. He was a precursor and a mentor to Freud. Grodek says, "It must not be forgotten that the brain, and therefore the intellect, is itself created by the it." Remember Freud's id? That's just German for it. They couldn't give it a name, so they just said, it's the it. It works in German. Doesn't do so good in English again. So this it, long before the brain comes into existence, the it of man is already active and thinking without the brain, since it must first construct the brain before it can use it to think with. This is a fundamental point, and one we are inclined to ignore or forget. In the assumption that one thinks only with the brain is to be found the origin of 1,001 absurdities. You can take that, say that again. The origin also of many valuable discoveries and inventions. Much that adorns life and much that makes it ugly. Over and against the it, there stands the ego. All right, that's a conscious mind. The I, which I take to be merely a tool of the it, but which we are forced by nature to regard as the its master. That's just sleight of hand, right? There's a lot of luminescence, a lot of narrowness, a lot of focus, a lot of heat. When it comes to the ego, the other thing is a little bit more abstract, obviously. So there's many reasons even why that happens, that we take the ego for the whole self. But we don't have time to explore that. Greg, again, another head honcho, modern, more up-to-date, who's kind of going against the flow and saying, look, let's just accept it. The facts are in, we can no longer deny it. There is the soul, there is the spirit. Let's just accept it finally. He says in his book, The Ancestral Mind, that the ancestral mind arose long before logic or language appeared, and because it came online first, it has maintained its ability to operate as a separate system, quite independent from the thinking mind. The ancestral mind learned to communicate emotional information intuitively, non-verbally, and non-consciously over the course of millions of years. And much of the emotional communication between people today is still non-verbal and unconscious. He goes on to say, it was the work of neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux that provided the physiological evidence for the key role played by unconscious processing in our emotional life. You know that whole stuff about the amygdala and all of the flight and fight? His research not only confirmed the functioning of the ancestral mind quite apart from the thinking mind, but also demonstrated that the brain itself gives priority to the unconscious messages from this older part of us. Well, well, well. Theodore Roszak, American eco-philosopher, in Voice of the Earth says, the id is that very proto-human psychic core that our evolution has spent millions of years molding to fit the planetary environment. Its seeming unruliness deserves a deeper understanding, if only because it grows from a long evolutionary history. In the course of that history, its dominant characteristics must have been selected for some good reason. And they're getting there, they're getting there. The id conserves, from its long maturing process, our treasury of ecological intelligence. Oh, so now we see a bridge between the Umwelt intelligence. Remember I chose to put the circle around the other two? Now you see why I did that. It's not good enough just to include it on the same ontological level as the other two. No, no, no. It's primary. So the treasury of ecological intelligence, its intractability stems from its deeply ingrained resistance. Look at that. Its intractability, this is the subconscious part of you, which makes up the biggest part of you, is oozing with rebellion, right? Its intractability stems from its deeply ingrained resistance to all social forms that endanger the harmony of the human and the natural. Its untamed selfishness represents a bond between psyche and cosmos, whose distant origins reach back to the initial conditions of the Big Bang. So it's a tough son of a bitch. Just as there is a wisdom of the body, says Roszak, which often has a better sense of health than medical science, so too there may be a wisdom of the id that knows what sanity is better than any school of psychiatry whose standard of normality is essentially a defense of misconceived social necessity. These are the facts you need to remember, because this is every point that these people are making is the exact contradiction on the other side. Black and white. White squares, black squares. These are the ones who are revealing, they're the ones who contradict. They are Satan, the word actual Satan just means opposer. So these Luciferians are, we now know what they're opposing is this. Robert Temple goes on to say, in 1890, the psychologist Dr. Morton Prince remarked on the possibility of there being normally in all of us a lower stratum of consciousness which is alive to everything about us while our upper minds are busy. Pay attention to this diagnosis of upper and lower. It'll become important in a few minutes. Why did he use those terms? Religion's full of terms about upper and lower and lesser and greater, okay? So just pay attention to that, and then that point that Roszak made there about the wisdom of the body. Now just keep that in the back of your mind for a minute. The man who did the biggest damage to the physicalists, you must know his work, you must know his work, is Hilgard. He says that, or Robert Temple says that, as for the deep self, presumed to be identical with Hilgard's hidden observer, standing partially outside of time, remember that? There is a great deal of evidence for this phenomena. The fullest account of it is in the remarkable book Divided Consciousness by one of America's most noted psychologists, Professor Ernest Hilgard. In his book, Hilgard points out that the very word profound comes from profundus, meaning near the bottom. Again, there we go, another reference to the bottom. Now, research shows that even under deep hypnosis, part of the mind remains aware. Hypnotists have loosely referred to this deep, subtle field of awareness as the self. Well, I wish they'd bloody told us that 50, 60 years ago when positivism and Bertrand Russells were running loose with their tails wagging behind them. We have been knee-deep, you know, anyone who knows philosophy knows this. We've been knee-deep, we've been Tweedledee and Tweedledum pillow fighting for centuries over, and now they've actually found it in laboratories, and begrudgingly have to give it a name, and first they try, well, let's just call it the hidden observer and hope we can get away with that. They do anything and call it spirit and soul. Come on, you have to really goad them to go there, right? Because what will that do to their science? So they're creeping forward and then go, self. Speak up. So fuck. Caught, while they put nails in the tongues of the Giordano Brunos, told the Wilhelm Reichs where to go, told the Nikola Teslas, the Wilhelm Reichs, and so many like them, get out of here, right? Ripping the medals off their chests, telling them where to go. The list is endless. Raymond Royal Rife, I could go on forever on. And now they creep up behind and go, well, guess what? We find it. We got the evidence for it. It makes me sick. Jung says that we know that the mask of the unconscious is not rigid. This is a key point too. So now we know that the mask of the unconscious is not rigid. Okay, what does that mean? It reflects the face we turn toward it. Hostility lends it a threatening aspect. Friendliness softens its features. Well, wait a minute. So now it's a mirror. Now we're in the realm of John Cocteau and Orpheus? That's right. Like any mystery, if you turn fear, suspicion, hidden agenda, curiosity, idle curiosity, or filth and toxicity and destructiveness and all the rest of it toward the mystery, that mystery, you'll be greeted by demons. And you may take them for real, but they're actually laughing. If you turn faith, understanding, right? Power, courage, wisdom, love, care, you meet angels. But that is reflective. That is purely specular. All mysteries are, and the mystery of yourself is no different. What this explains is this next point. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from facing their souls. Right? The 2 points go together. Because if you are toxic, destructive, aggressive, greedy, vain, and all the rest of it, which we can point them out pretty quickly, who they are, then the last thing you want to be doing is looking into your own unconscious. So, because they know what they're going to meet there. And therefore you then have to create a psychoanalysis, and you have to create a psychiatry with their injections and their pills, and you have all this pseudo stuff that Thomas Szasz and R.D. Laing and Arno Gruen have gone blue in the face trying to deconstruct. That big pharma and many other things, even the education systems, you have to create all of that to create a paradigm of consciousness, paradigm of the mind, and you've got to sell it through all their high priests in the textbooks and what have you. And if we had time, I've got some hilarious stuff with R.D. Laing, a live video of him telling you how preposterous this stuff is, and also where it's heading. Nietzsche puts it in his usual way, as succinctly but poetically as possible. Why does man not see things as they are, he says, because he himself is standing in the way. What does he mean by that? He means the social persona. He takes it for granted we got two selves. It's that other self conditioned entirely by the world that we spoke of. That's what's standing in the way. In fact, the artist Magritte, the French artist Magritte, he said, everything we see, right? Everything we see conceals something else we want to see. Everything we see, everything we look at, actually conceals, whether we realize it or not, something else we would probably want to see. And Nietzsche is saying, yeah, and you do that yourself in your own mind. But back to this key point, it was one of the big themes, one of the big ingredients that connects. When I did my review slides, we talked about the primal trauma, but then as a subset of it, the root of all the disorders isn't actually shame and guilt. What I mean by that is officially, if you don't buy into prehistory or theories of prehistory, then the average student of psychology will always tell you that primal shame or guilt, or both, is the root of all the other disorders, right? Obsessive, compulsive, neurotic, paranoid, schizophrenic, inauthenticity, the list is endless. All that cocktail laundry list of disorder, they originate with this primal guilt and primal shame of living the inauthentic life and what have you. However, unfortunately, as brilliant as that theory is, and I do mean that, I'm not being flippant, that is a brilliant theory and should be studied. However, when you bring in and plug in the idea that the human race has lived in prehistoric times, pre-Diluvian times, that needs to nudge over a bit because it's superseded by yet a far deeper origin or seed or nucleus of all pathology. And as far as I know, I'm the only one to really address it. And if others have, I mention them in my work. And it is this thing called the antipathy to nature. I refer to it in other work as the mysterium. But we don't want to get into all of that. But just when you go and see the references later, you'll know what I mean. When you see this word mysteria or mysterium, I'm actually referring almost entirely to this a more clarified point here about this antipathy to nature. And what I mean by that is a deep, unbelievably deep root, as deep as shame, as deep as guilt, and all the other things that are accepted by psychologists, but probably even infinitely more deep. Why not? When Earth did what we've been describing and what I spend most of my time talking about in the Atlantis book, when the cataclysm of Mother Nature, right, we're talking about the ancients understood nature as a living thing, and in which they had complete trust. I mean, they had a complete umbilical connection and rapport with that matrix, with nature, what we today call nature, the Umwelt. When it appears to you that Mother Nature has erupted under your feet, and you've got the worst Charlton Heston disaster movie going on all around you that is now affecting completely your consciousness, you don't recover from it thinking very well of Mother Earth anymore. And we have to cut it short. So all I can get into right now, and the references go into it in infinite greater detail, right, is that the first instinct, the one most embedded, the deepest, darkest, filthiest root within us, that is absolutely the inverted tree of all the other pathologies and all the other rotten fruit that we experience in daily life, is this, I believe, antipathy to nature. A deep resentment and hate and fear, or whatever you want to call it, you know, different words, different language, different traditions, of nature itself. Now, on the surface, we may have respect and love. You know, I'm not talking about conscious conditionings. You know, Mom and Dad brought us up to respect animals and nature. That's fine and dandy. It's not really connected to what I'm talking about. And by the way, if we look at the utter destructiveness, as we pointed out earlier, that we actually really do to nature, there's an incredible connection here between these two realities. But let's move on. So it's the origin of all pathology, except for the fact that there's two kinds of pathology. There's the personal pathology, right? Remember, said of the inner world, your little Eigenwelt having its neurotic problems, and then there's the outplaying of that in the social context. All of the more obvious social pathologies, A to Z insanity, out there. Two kinds of pathology. Well, this is the root of both of them. You might ask, what can we do about it if this thing is so absolutely crucial, you know, the fissure that's created? And the answer is actually extremely simple, and that is, go back to her. Get back, have another dialogue, get out there, get out of the cities, go and find out. Not like, oh yeah, I love swimming, and you know, go with a blank mind. Start again. Bring the past here. Don't go back there, that's regression. Don't go back and say, well, I wish we had it in the older days, and we can't, and so I'll just watch a bunch of old black and white movies and all. Bring that here. Close time, transcend it, right? Say, I'll start again. I will not follow as all my forefathers who were infected with this trauma. I'll start right now. Because what did we talk about before? That psychic time doesn't exist. It exists on a different plane. You can do that. And if you're chained to the wheel, you can't do it. But you can decide in the moment of what we call the now, in the present, to transcend all time. And this is one way to do it. And you can actually physically do it as well. You actually don't really have to physically do it. You can do it just in your imagination. But you can even go out and walk in the world, walk in nature, and as an infant, but in a positive way. Reintroduce yourself to her, open up dialogue with her, and she'll speak back, and the whole job is done. You need no other human agency whatsoever except your own mind. And you're a concertina, right? You're concertining the time out, and you're deconstructing the trauma that happened to your mind and everyone else's mind. You're doing the holy work. And because again, more specifically, you're deflating this antipathy to nature. And Colonel James Bogue-Wright's one of the great mentors. He said, when you find the true poison in the blood, he was talking about politics and society, and about Big Brother, but the metaphor is magnificent. When you find the true poison in the blood and remove it, all the other little aberrations, you see, you don't have to go around and micromanage them now. Healing happens of its own accord. So I take the same metaphor here. Once you find the true poison in the psyche, then that world of Umwelt and its chaos and its George Bushes and its global villages and all the other palava is being rocked at the root. You may not see it originally, but all the mystics know that one small match, right, can light up a whole darkened room, but one small match of darkness can do nothing. You might not see it tremble, but the dam will bust. Through simple psychological and very simple operations, but done in the right way. It's not so much what you're doing, it's the way. So many times in life, it's not what he did or what she did, it's the way they did it that's the karma. The karma's not so much in the what, because we do a lot of things wrong, but that's just a mistake. It's the way that you do a thing that really sends the scales balancing for or against you. You need to do it as well, because the whole point we're trying to make here is that, and the thing that they've tried to separate, the other forces have come in to try and separate, is that we are nature. Your body, your eyes, your breathing, and everything you are is a product of the very nature I'm telling you to go back to, or suggesting that you go back to. In other words, what am I really saying is that you go back to yourself. Going back to the self is to go back to nature. Going back to nature is to go back to the self. You can argue forever against this, as many have done, and it will not come out right. You will lose every time. Because your very action, the very fact of sweating, the very act, go and research what it means to sweat when you're overheated and compare that to a car, any overheated machine, and compare the miracle. I'm not even talking about the miracle of blood, the miracle of the eye, the miracle of menstruation, the miracle of giving birth to a child. Let's even leave that out. The replication of cells. The very act of sweating will teach you that something's going on. It's unbelievable. Or that, as people have said, that even life is even on this planet, the statistic, the probability of that, the intelligent life being on this planet, is so astronomically impossible that it must have a cause. And in my other work, I get into that deeper stuff, right? But we just need to keep it very simple. In going back to the self, it implies as unison with nature. So you can do it the other way if you feel like it. You can go to nature, but you must go with that blank mind. As Bruce Lee said, every day, when I awake, like a student at his first class, I prepare a blank slate for the day to write upon. More profound words I can't think. But very hard. But you are the teacher. It's hard, but you're the teacher, not somebody else, and you're the student. You've immediately made yourself teacher and pupil, and brought back your sovereignty from that point. So when you go with that blank mind, she will do all the writing that is necessary. The very word neter, nature, came from the word in Egypt meaning gods, the goddess, the higher power, that which is eternal. Friedrich Schelling, the great German philosopher, idealist, he said that nature is visible spirit, spirit is invisible nature. Erich Fromm uses the term necrophilia, as we said. His counterpoint to that was biophilia, love of life. Biophilia is the passionate love of life and all that is alive. It is the wish for further growth. It is the wish to further growth, whether in a person, a plant, an idea, or a social group. The biophilious person wants to be more rather than to have more. Alan Watts, in his book, it's actually called The Book on the Taboo of Knowing Who You Are, he says, the prevalent sensation of oneself as a separate ego enclosed in a bag of skin is a hallucination which accords neither with Western science nor with experimental philosophy, religions of the East. This hallucination underlies the misuse of technology for the violent subjugation of man's natural environment and consequently its eventual destruction. Actually, it's our destruction. Nature isn't going anywhere. Lack of knowledge about the evolution of the organic from the inorganic, coupled with misleading myths about life coming into this world from somewhere else, has made it difficult for us to see that the biosphere arises or goes with a certain degree of geological and astronomical evolution. As Douglas E. Harding has pointed out, we tend to think of this planet as a life-infested rock, which is as absurd as thinking that the body is a cell-infested skeleton. Surely all forms of life, including man, must be understood as symptoms of the Earth, the solar system, and the galaxy, in which case we cannot escape the conclusion that the galaxy is intelligent. But we have escaped it. It's dumb, we're smart. He says, in short, he says, we do not come into this world, we come out of it as leaves from a tree, as the ocean waves, the universe peoples. Right? The wave comes from the ocean, the people come from the universe. How could it ever have been anything else? Werner Heisenberg, the quantum scientist, puts it in language I think is very, very brilliant. Simple but brilliant. He says, look, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of understanding. So this is just even the first point. We don't observe nature as it is. And he's even talking about himself, all these quantum scientists. Because he was digging into what the problem is. How can they crack this code of why, why the realities on the micro level are so unbelievably different on the macro level? They should be the same. One should be confirming the other. In other words, To paraphrase what they say, the quantum scientists, the deeper and deeper we go into matter, the more it looks like mind. 3 fucking cheers. That was been said by, do you know how many mystics have died horrible deaths saying that? And now they're going to take the credit for it? But nobody has put the matter better than the great protege of Gerald Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, the American scholar. And way of seeing, as we said, is one of the major themes of this talk. He says, look, the real Maya, remember that's the Vedic word for, oh, we're all in the realm of the Maya, we're all in the realm of karma, right? Well, he knocks that on the head. He says, look, the real Maya or illusion is not the natural forms, but the mind's propensity to conceive or project forms created by its own inventiveness, but which do not agree with the truth extant or potential in nature. The mysterium. The illusion, the Maya, is the way we see the world. Prakriti, Maya. It's not the Maya itself. That reflects back whatever we want it to look like. So if you look at it as one thing, a wave, it's a wave. If you look at a particle, it's a particle. If you look at it as destructive and meaningless and mindless and soulless and mechanical, then it can accommodate. Then he goes on to say that, look, thinking which does not start from and continue in close relation to its foundations in the physical universe must lead to falsity, and it has. In the ancient Aryan texts, like the Srimad Bhagavatam, they emphasize that, look, what we're talking about right now is known already by our ancestors. And Aryan, by the way, does not mean what most people think it means. An Aryan can be from any race. They mean the elect, the elders, the brothers of light, the servants of truth. The Aryans do not kill even the small plant unnecessarily, not to speak of cutting trees for sense gratification. Aryans do not distinguish between lower and higher grades of life. All life should be protected. All living beings have a right to live, even the trees and plants. This is the basic principle of an Aryan civilization. So an enlightened civilization. But how can the self-murdered, self-butchered, self-hating, self-sadistic man operate on that level? It's impossible. As Schopenhauer said, for animals, this world is hell, and man, the demons who torture them. Freud spoke very emphatically about what he referred to as oceanic experiences. We just had a little aside about going to nature or even music or whatever. But the choice is yours, with the emphasis again that it's not so much the what, because you can be sitting on the beach bored as hell. It's not so much the what, it's the way. What you're really in choice of, where your choice really operates, is when you go to something, or you go to nature, or you even go to look at a wall, something ugly, some of these rotten buildings around here or whatever. That's the what. All the broken down stuff and the dilapidations and the corrosion and even rust. Whatever you happen to be looking at, your choice is the way that you look at it, the way you observe it. That's where the magic really is. It's really what animals are doing. They're doing the what, but they're also doing something quite different. They're in a different level of communication that is not rooted in what? It's not rooted in antipathy to nature. They have antipathy to us. A bird will come and sit on a horse's head, but you can go within 12 feet and it's already buggered off. Now, why is that? Because they have antipathy to us because we got antipathy to nature. See how it works? Once upon a time they didn't, as Professor Tolkien and others have clearly, although in fictional terms, they knew they had to do it that way, have explained. But until we lose the antipathy to nature, you can't be doing bugger all with animals. They're too smart. They stay well away from us. They know what we are, what we're thinking. Their intelligence is still rooted into the real. Or music. Music is so key. The greatest philosophers who speak about the subjects we're discussing here have emphasized music and poetry over and over again. In fact, the greatest philosopher who spoke of these, Martin Heidegger, a German, he resigned his seat because he said that even philosophy, and this is a man who's preeminent in the subject of modern philosophy, he gave up his seat and only spoke from that point on about poetry and music because he said that philosophy is ended. Philosophy is no longer capable of going where we need it to go. And a remarkable and amazing statement. And spent the rest of his career dealing only strictly with poetry and music. Leonard Shlain puts it more succinctly. He says that the ability of species to generate and respond to music is one of the great unexplained mysteries of nature. Apparently, appreciation of music is built into the genetic foundation of all higher life forms. In humans, perfect pitch seems to be encoded somewhere within the strands of DNA. If the fittest do need to survive, then how does the ability to sing in key or keep time to rhythm complement or enhance that survival? Well, the answer is it doesn't. It's of something else, right? It's the fragrance of the rose. And your response to it is very, very important. But it's not everybody's response to it, like this cheese ball music, the packaged crap that they want everybody to just imbibe. And that point is brought up by another philosopher, psychologist, Wilhelm Wildebond. He says that there's two forms of experience. And we said the what and the way. He makes it far more eloquent. Ideographic and nomothetic. Ideographic experience is a meaningful event or experience which cannot be replicated. So, goodbye Dawkins, goodbye Dennett, goodbye all you clinicians in white, sorry, not needed here. It won't be replicated. You can't stand on the same piece of water twice. You can't have even the same thought twice. So then there's the opposite of that, which the scientists can measure and fine, I'm not arguing with that, is nomothetic, experiences which are replicable and scientifically verifiable. They've got those experiences. But why don't they tell us that there's other experiences that they simply can't measure with their measuring instruments? One important aside, but it's so important because even from what we've been discussing, you may imbibe this fallacy. And it's the fallacy that's been almost ubiquitous throughout all of philosophy and psychology, and that is that the unconscious is actually a place. A region, a zone, right? This is something we automatically embody without thinking about it, and of course it's utter nonsense. And the point was brought up by Grodek, who was onto this from instantly. Grodek is the originator of this idea of way of seeing. He's most careful to insist that the it or the id is not a thing in itself, but merely a way of seeing. I think that when you fully grasp that, you have completely got the steering wheel in your hands. Because the fallacy of thinking it's a place, it's a region, it's in the back of my mind, it's over here, and we do this in the language. The language doesn't help us a lot. Unconscious, this murky realm, bottomless pit, Dante's Inferno, all of this stuff is really, in a way, lovely metaphor, but it's very, very unhelpful. Once you suddenly realize that it's just a way of seeing, you have the power. It's brought back into you because it's fully under your suzerainty at that point. And probably the greatest exponent of these ideas, and I say greatest because the most physicalist, the man who brought, let's not even use the word physicalist because I've been using it in a negative connotation, let's say materialist. It's the question you all have. What's the physical answer? What's the physical answer? Well, the man who had more to do with that physicalizing of all of this abstractia was Wilhelm Reich. He just happened to die in a federal stockade, but, let's leave that aside. Arrested for, what was it, if they don't get you on what was the famous one with Oscar Wilde, corrupting the youth, they'll get you on something likewise, They'll always dig out something you've never heard of. Healing people, wow, can't have that. Right? So, but to just a little bit get behind what Reich's teachings were, and also I mean Alexander Lowen, his protege, is a quote from Julian Jaynes which says, "There's nothing in consciousness that is not an analog of something that was not in behavior first." Right? That's the physicalist point of view. If it's in consciousness, look, it begins with behavior. But something, they're right. They're absolutely right. The only problem that they make is that, okay, so what you're saying is that there's no thoughts in the brain isn't doing anything, those are epiphenomena of the brain's mechanical action, or they don't exist at all. And it's all part of the physical experience of life. I can only agree with that. But that physical experience is spiritual. And slowly some of these people are starting to connect with this. Right? So let's just hold that thought as we move through this. Alexander Lowen and Wilhelm Reich completely were Freudians, right? Reich was a Freudian and then parted with the school of Freud because he had some differences. And his differences were monumentally important, so much so that they probably, actually, arguably, he is the greatest mind that ever lived. As I said, they all end up the same way. And I'm not forcing you to believe that what he was saying is true. I'm just saying, If his stuff is true, then he would have to be up there. And what is he really saying? Is unbelievable in simplicity but beauty. He's saying, first he's saying what we've already discovered, and that is, stop thinking of ego and unconscious and conscious and superego as regions and some anatomy, some mechanical thing. It's very simple, he would say. The outer part of your body, and that's the skin and the subcutaneous fat, right? I couldn't really find good pictures, but the one on the left pretty shows you the outline of a body. The black line of the exterior of the body and maybe an inch or so, right, in the subcutaneous fat. Reich is telling you that that is the ego. And what he's really saying is that the body is the ego. But he specifically meant the surface of the body. And he is the founder and creator of what is known as the bioenergetic movement that Alexander Lowen took off and, much publicized more while his mentor was dying in jail, right? So Lowen takes this forward and says, look, basically for us, the ego is the physical body. And we know what that means because it relates to nature, right? But then they specify by saying it's the bioenergetic flow from the core of your being, and as it moves out to the surface of your body, to the skin, and of course you know about Reich being the structuralist who heal you by fixing the structure. I mean, that's a given, that's the textbook. But I'm talking about the ideology behind why they have a physical approach that then launched many other New Age and holistic practices. They're based in this philosophy. The external part of the skin and the body, and also the face and its movements and how we relate to the world and give, that is the ego, period. Absolutely, literally. And the unconscious is when the bioenergy is flowing and moves more in towards the center of the being. Perhaps the spine, I'm not an expert, I don't know, he just said the core of the being. But what does that sound like? Where have we heard that before? In the Eastern traditions, right, the Vedas, where they talk about the Kundalini energy. So again, maybe not. I think they were saying the same thing. They would have called it the prana, the energy, the movement of the prana. You call it bioenergy, you call it elan vital, you call it will to power. It really doesn't matter. But that simple energy flow, in fact, you could even call it a discourse, a language. When energy, bioenergy is moving out to the surface, when you wake up in the morning, that's how you're able to even get up and go to work. Energy has moved it flushes into the muscular energy and into the skin. You're now in the ego mode. And the deeper, more silent, central part of you is the subconscious, the self, the hidden observer. Do you remember I asked you to note that idea about the upper and lower and keep it in your mind? It's because that's what this is. Except it's not upper and lower, it's inner and outer. But they're just metaphors, it's just explanation. So, but the Reichian Lowen approach is that the inner core, physically, bioenergetically, biologically, and energetically is the true self, is the hidden observer, not some little ghost in the back of your unconscious hiding out. Because if you actually think about it, that makes no sense at all, and you're back to some sort of bizarre Wizard of Oz. Why are you hiding behind the curtain scenario? No, this thing isn't hiding behind any curtain. It's always conversing and speaking with you daily. And the skin, the surface of what we call our skin, what we call that thing in the mirror, is the self, is the ego speaking back. A dialogue of bioenergy. So consciousness or intelligence, I agree with these physicalists when they say, it's not the brain, there's no proof. That's right. But then you have to admit that the totality of the physical is intelligent, which they won't do, or not in anything like the level that's needed, right? This concept explains what? In the introduction, we talk about the two selves and the two forms of anxiety and all the rest of it comes with it. That now is fully 100% explained. There are two selves. We said the social persona, right? And the inner, the Eigenwelt, and the social persona, the pseudo-self. But you can reconfigure this, that the outer self, your skin, your ego, right, is the persona that you show to the world, so they're identical. And then the inner world, the hidden observer, the self, is that other voice. Take that as a given, because it's the next point that's really the most important. And that is that, can we do the music thing now? Douglas can hit us with an EF and a D to explain this point in just a second. Because the next point is that, remember I showed you that chart of duality? That because we have the split and fragmentation in the mind between the listener and the speaker, or the other examples we've gave, about this concept that there is this duality or there's this fragmentation, this split. That has given rise to all of our concepts and philosophies of division, duality, fragmentation, upper, lower, inner and outer, God and devil, and all of that. All that cocktail comes in because of the existence of these two realms, two voices, right? But once you understand that there are two voices of the same entity, your whole perception changes. And after that, you will then also have to grasp that the dialogue between them is a very healthy dialogue, and as I showed in the previous slide, that dialogue is the intelligence. And the brain that you have in your head, that the physicalists have rightly said cannot be considered the center. They're right. All that is a processor or a cell through which all the parts of your body, and by the way, the Egyptians, in the Egyptian magical tradition and the Druidic tradition, they weren't just talking about two cells. They say the liver, the organ, the skin, the brain, the cells, all, you have millions of cells conversing all the time, and the brain is the processor. But there's so much activity in the brain that obviously, to the primitivists that we are 100 years ago in science, we imagine that this overactive thing up here in the skull is the center of consciousness, when in fact it's merely the processor. The center of consciousness is internal, just in the same way that you could say Kundalini, and the external part is the outer manifestation or social persona of that. And the way that I always traditionally explain it to myself and to others is using metaphor of music. And that there are two realities on any musical instrument, or in music in general. And that is that you have, like for instance on a guitar, you get 6 strings. We actually have 7 if you consider that the neck is a string, because one string to hold the rest of the strings together. You have normally 22 frets. Oh, 7 over 22, huh? Guess what? Just pure coincidence. But we're not even going to use chords. Right? There's 3 masculine strings, 3 feminine strings. So a chord is by unity. Right? The very fact that you can strum a chord, in fact, give us a A or C or whatever you feel like. Right there is the copulation, so to speak, symbolically, of male and female, because you have 6 strings, 3 which are male, the upward pointing triangle, and 3 downwards, which is the 3 female strings or lighter strings. And so a thing called a chord is already Tantra. Just even that is amazing enough. The 722 is amazing enough. But we're not even going to do more than 1 string here. If you play the, was it the E? I don't know the technical terms, but yeah, hit it again, pretty, yeah. That's that extrovert, happy major chord, right, major note, which is the social persona and the focus on the world and interactions and sort of this sunny, solar type of expression. And give us the next one, which is, I think, an F. Yeah, hit that again. You can just hear the sitar, right? That's totally different. That's the feminine, the lunar, the quiet, the introverted, the inner. The melancholic, the sorrow. How can a materialist say that those 2 voices are not part of one being? Because the metaphor we're using is hit the open F, or the D. What Dougie just played there, right, the E and the F, give us it again. Oh, the fretted notes. That was the first one. Right, now let go into the open, or on 1 string. So the major solar, give us that fretted note again, and the feminine lunar, right, which is right brain, left brain, I don't care what kind of tradition you come from, is on what? 1 single string. There is no such thing as duality. You are that string. And let me tell you something else fascinating about this metaphor. Thank you very much, Dougie. And that is this, that you can't change that. That's the music of the spheres. See, that's out of your hands. That's Umwelt. You can't change harmony. You can't change that. Now, you can change it if you detuned it, but then you created disharmony. And that's what we're doing. That's what we are. That's what we have done. Professor Tolkien has the greatest explanation of what I'm talking about in his book, The Silmarillion. Just read the first 40 pages, and you won't want to read another book as long as you live of this concept. In this concept, they've hidden from us this truth. We're not even talking about chords and the rest of the strings or the 88 keys on a piano. There's one simple metaphor, that the inner voice, that darker voice you don't want to listen to, the feminine, quiet, melancholic, and the outer are 2 expressions of a single intelligence. And they've created such a racket so that we will never find this out. But also, man is not higher than the law. You can't change the cosmic law. Those are frequencies of the universe, the music of the spheres. that Pythagoras and Plato bowed to and says, this is eternal. And if we try to mess with it, try to change it, we create untold disharmony in the world, which is what is happening. It's harmony or disharmony. And that metaphor of music is just the self. You are that string, and you can either be in harmony, and how we already explained how you get in disharmony with it. The chronic need for dependence and letting everybody else tell you that dissonance is music. The thing is, look, you have absolute choice. Let's get this really clear and logical. You have the absolute choice to detune your instrument. But then don't come and tell me you're going to be a Beethoven or a Bach. Right? Do it. You have the choice. I'm not even interfering with that. Nobody can interfere with another person's choice. In fact, the universe doesn't. The universe does not interfere with your choice. We'll get to that in a minute. But let me nail this home. You have the choice. But then do not tell me that you are going to create music. Right? That's something different. That reality you can never change. Now, to emphasize this point about you've heard it. How many times have you actually even physically heard it said that the universe is in harmony? I mean, hands up. Have you actually heard that term before? Just honestly, have you ever heard the term being said, the universe is in harmony? It is. But I don't think many people have actually really contemplated what that really means. The universe is in perfect balance and harmony with you. And the greatest symbol of harmony is the scales, right? So what this actually means is a little bit more sinister than what we first thought. Yes, the universe is in harmony with you. Remember that specular mirror? So what happens is, whatever you are, it harmonizes. I like this concept a lot. So, in other words, it means that if you're in disharmony, it's in disharmony. It's all specular. The unconscious mystery and the external one, right, are the same. So if you shine that face of fear and all of that other gunk towards the outer mystery or inner mystery, it reflects it back. It's in harmony with what you are. Everybody thinks, oh, the universe is in harmony. I just love that New Age concept. It's marvelous. I think about it all the time. Yeah, well, you better think about it a bit bloody stronger. Because it actually means, and believe me, once you've fully understood this point, you have completely cracked the Gordian knot of the difference between magic and sorcery. Meaning that sorcery is when you think you have operation and the universe is in harmony and all this other nonsense. Or you're misusing it, obviously, because of some reason. But the moment that you understand this point, that it harmonizes with you, it dances with you, it is a Strauss waltz, an amazing dance, an amazing shadow play. What you do, it does. Where you go, it reciprocates. It's a ballet. All life is. And the universe is the dancer. You may say love is the answer, but nobody bleeds from the dancer. Ever remember that line from the song Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath? You may say love is the answer, but nobody bleeds for the dancer. Because you're not in harmony with her. You're not in harmony with her. And that's why kings and queens can steal your dreams and tell you that the moon is just the sun at night. So when you've understood this, you become enlightened. But as you know from following my work, anyone who's really followed it closely, I do not associate enlightenment with luminescence necessarily, maybe secondarily, thirdly. My metaphor that I always encourage you to understand about enlightenment is lightness. Light as a feather. In fact, the very symbol that the Egyptians used for that harmony of the universe, what do you find on the scales? Is that feather of enlightenment. Light as a feather. You will pass through the judgment, heavy, burned bright by the sun of religion and the solar cult Luciferian princes of light who've blinded our minds. And then you're even mind-controlled into associating enlightenment with what they want you to associate it with. It is a completely different reality than that. It is a complete state of lightness and innocence that maybe you see in children. And what you certainly see in many animals, so much so it's frightening. That light feather, which must be balanced with your heart, your soul, is an enlightenment that has completely been misconstrued by these religious vermin who've infected us with all their memes and their pestilence. You know why? Because they are infected. They don't see what we're talking about. That's their reality, but it need not be our reality. And the difference between the magic and the sorcery is to understand that absolutely the whole universe, the whole of the Umwelt is in perfect balance and harmony. But what that means for us as a reality is that when you step into that sanctum, When you step into the holy place, when you step into the tabernacle, the whole church, the whole tabernacle morphs as you are. You meet yourself. You meet yourself. Bruce Lee said it. When you look into the book of life, you find there's no enlightenment outside yourself. All that other stuff about higher self in a mystical, mysterious way, right? The higher self, oh, it's Jesus, it's some mystery. That's what I call mysteria. Mysteria. We're mysteria haunted, we're mysteria possessed. It's just abstractia from people who can never get this, will never get it, have not got it, but have a lot of power to write shit down so that you'll have to read it. Right? And basically it boils down to, again, the simple action of a change in the way of seeing. This is the key. This is the tool that does this. This is the meter, the switch, the on and off switch that makes this happen. The switch between the sorcerer and the magic is simply an alternation done daily, I must add. Okay, that much is hard. You can't just do it once. It's a constant, that's the meditation. The meditation is not what they say it is. Meditation is the simple everyday recalibrating, reorientating between this way of seeing. And if you can do this, then you are enlightened. If you can't do it, then not a word I say can register. If you can't change that way of seeing, it's the settings. And what do we also imply by that? That you are doing it. The very act of choice is also to be focused on. Blake says that when the doors of perception are cleansed, man sees things as they truly are, infinite. That's what we're doing. When you've cleansed the doors of perception, you understand this fundamental point. And you're in alignment with the self. Why? Because you've done it. Do you remember the whole concept of you know the tree by its fruit? If people babble on like I've been doing about self, somebody will come up and say, look, what does it do? What does the self do? Everything, in order to know it, it has to do something. You know a tree by its fruit. The self is immediately active in you when you do this very thing. The very act of the self, changing its settings, the way of seeing, and its action of recalibrating with the self and with nature is the only act of self that it's capable of. The self is almost purely defensive. This will become clear in a minute. Vladimir Soloviev, the Russian author, he said, "It is time when men realized their oneness with Mother Earth and rescued her from the lifelessness so they can save themselves from death. But what oneness can we have with the Earth when we have no such oneness, no such relationship with ourselves?" You see, he's completely conversant in that unison, that nucleation of the two voices. So here we have it more succinctly. Changing perspective from the pseudo-self to the imperial self. From the Midwelt and the Umwelt into the Eigenwelt. That shift, who did it? The self. And that very act is of the self for the self. You've just become a self in the very act of doing that. That is what it does. It's defensive. It's a free, more commonly, street level, we just say it's a free act of will. It's an act of free will, right? And one other metaphor to explain this is that if you're standing in front of me right there, obviously I cannot occupy that same space that you're standing on. The only way I can do it is parasitically jump on you, and that's unsustainable. Neither of us could work. It might be good for a laugh, but function ceases. So in the same way, in exactly the same way as you cannot occupy the physical space of another person if they're standing on it, in exactly the same way you cannot perceive for another person, and you certainly can't think for another person. No matter what some globalist like Brzezinski tells you is possible. I'd like to see the magic trick that can make that happen. It cannot happen. You cannot think for another, you cannot perceive, and I really just mean that physically, even looking, the act of looking. You can't look for another, and you can't stand on the space of another without a parasitical or ultimately destructive act. That means, as Ayn Rand and so many else, and Nathaniel Braden and God knows how many else I can mention, have emphasized over and over again, that makes it a selfish act. Oh dear, the word we all despise so badly. That makes the act of perception, the act of thought, and the act of standing selfish. Yet look at the absolute reconfiguration and complete devilry that has been done regarding that word. What does it mean then if it is an act of self? If it's completely independent? It means no gurus, no priests, no leaders, no experts, no gimmicks, no techniques required. Why? Because what are those gimmicks? Why? How dare I say that? How dare I, critique this new age and all this stuff? Because for the simple point is this, that these brothers of light, this architects of control, are fully conversant, as I've been saying so many times. They're ahead of us, you see. They're the tiger in the long grass that actually know a lot of what we've been talking about. They know that you're depressed and frustrated and fragmented and that you'll want to seek alleviation. So they funded all this other gimmickry to attract you in exactly the same way P.G. Barnum would do it. They want you to give your power over to a guru or a teacher, because then there's another person involved. You've just divided yourself from yourself. You're no longer an actual self. And more importantly, all that gimmickry, all that nonsense, that Oprah Winfrey, God knows what, all of that palaver is you strangling yourself in the web that they've made as you try to be free. You got to give it to them. They're brilliant. I always have given it to them. They deserve the power they've got. They deserve the medals. They really do. Because they've even constructed this maze, this unbelievable matrix of control, what I call this architecture of control, knowing that you're going to want to escape it, like some sort of Logan's Run situation, right? Or, the White Queen or the Red Queen, I can't remember, in Alice, she's running faster, 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 and getting nowhere. If anything, they come right back to the door they were trying to get away from. The point is that you've not only given up your sovereignty to the other, which is bad enough, I mean, I draw the line at that, but what you've also done is in thinking that you actually have a legitimate means of escape, sold to you by some gimmick merchant, well-meaning as he may be. The point is that you are now strangling yourself in your very attempts to be free. William Blake said it, unless I build my own system, I am automatically enslaved by the systems of others. And he's the one who talked about the crooked roads of imagination. Remember at the beginning we introduced the great word imagination, the greatest word in the English language? Wasn't Blake the one who said the crooked roads of imagination in contradistinction to the straight roads of rationalism and science? Now, I have to say it, but that enlightened being who has recalled his self to himself, sacrificed himself to himself, is basically can be defined as a morally superior being. Another word you should never use, Michael. Where have you been? Shut up about superiority. Yeah, well, okay, I granted to speak of that in terms of race and all, finances and material. Yeah, that's nonsense, right? But it is not nonsense to talk about a man who has become aware of the mysteries of life. That man is a morally superior being. And he has no easy job because, as we said, that operation of the self is purely defensive in every sense that that word means. It can go wrong, meaning that the wall you build to keep others out can indeed keep you in. That becomes then a neurotic situation. We don't doubt that for a minute. But don't forget the original point that I made. That man, that superior man, is known. He's a moral man. This is how you know it. Again, I'm giving you the acid test. He not only tries his best to his last dying breath, like a Shelley, to get rid of the monsters above him, the tyrants above him, but he enslaves no one himself. He's equally vigilant for the slave below him. Khalil Gibran said something magical. He said, on the road to enlightenment, when I meet an impediment and a rock, I got two questions. People have gone on this road before me. How come that rock they didn't move? How come it's still there? And now that I have encountered the rock, I am honor bound to remove it for those who follow me. That is the morally superior man. The point being that you free yourself from tyranny above you, but you do not set yourself up to tyrannize other people. We know this, the relationships are the measure of us, is it not? I don't want to be dependent on anyone, but I'm equally vigilant for my friend or associate because I refuse to make her dependent on me. And when it happens and when I see it taking place, I have to get to the morally superior mode and we dialogue about what's happening in this dynamic. And hopefully by that model, she will do the same thing. I actually learned this from other people. I hadn't the faintest fucking notion about any of this until I learned it from other people. So don't think anybody, no, I've said before, no one person has all the answers. We're all discovering and all learning this together. And I'm sharing with you, what I've learned from these masters and these great people, men and women alike, and even the personal stuff I have learned from interactions, gone through the hell, gone through the difficulty to learn these facts. But once you do this, and hopefully if you are lucky enough, you do have somebody else who's doing it likewise, As problematic and as difficult and often unbelievably painful as it is a real life. Because you're saying, don't lean, don't lean. And even if you fall and break your soul, I have to allow you to do that. And you must allow me to do it. Because I'm empty, I need you, you're empty, you need me, isn't going to work in this world, and it's bringing this world to total destruction. In every conceivable way. That is the poison in the blood. Viktor Frankl, one of the great existentialists, psychologists, he said, everything can be taken from man, but one thing, the last of his human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given sense of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And the monumental statement is this, earth-shaking statement from Ayn Rand. Civilization, she says, isn't this globalism? Civilization is the process of setting man free from man. Total liberation, willingly, not in force. You can't shake hands with a clenched fist. My life is only a life of living, of moral superiority, when I encourage you to do as I'm doing, not with brute force. When you don't see it. See, once you've imbibed this philosophy, the opposite is instantly observable, instantly. Even to a child, and we'll get to the children in just a second. But once you've understood the truth, the opposite is automatically seen. In the beginning we said, until the false is seen as false, the truth is not. This is the truth. And therefore, once you see that, you know immediately that what I can sense, I can understand. We've done our Piggy Malone. The two worst detectives in the world have actually come up trumps. Charlie Farley and Piggy Malone have actually found the pot of gold. Clambering over each other and making a mess of it, and they actually found the answer. Because they're able to now to have an answer that they can use as a meter to say, that's false, that stinks, that's full of lies. And I have zero tolerance for the lie. And that state of existential sovereignty is explained by the author William Barrett in his book Irrational Man. He says, this seriousness, by the way, this is a picture of Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher I was talking about, who went to the greatest depth to speak about these points we're sharing, and commenting on the works of Heidegger and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Ponty. These are the four great philosophers that I've been basically paraphrasing all through tonight. Barrett says of their philosophy, their understanding, this seriousness is the simple and forthright seriousness of someone who has at last arrived at the center, and who is therefore at last totally engaged in the project of his life, with all that it entails. Right? It's not exclusive, it's not divided, it's not, oh, I like this, but I don't like that. And therefore, what he does, he says, this person exists under the eye of eternity. Right? He and nature are one. He and the universe are now in perfect harmony. And therefore, what he does in the moment is absolutely real. Arrow to bow, yin to yang. And Heidegger was the man who said that just as when you didn't have this and your relationship to the Umwelt was purely violent, as we said, all actions of men in the fallen state towards nature and animals and God knows what is incredibly violent, technologically, I mean, once you have entered into the state of enlightenment, it changes from a technological approach to nature, right, the subjugation of nature and the rape of nature, into what Heidegger called care, is the English version. In German it's Sorge, S-O-R-G-E, the profound care of life and existence and being. To use Nietzsche's phrase, this would be the man who is in his will to power, that vastly maligned philosophy of pure Nietzsche, which is so easy to explain. The élan vital, the life force, the prana, the bioenergy, which he just referred to as, the will to power. You're in that state. You are a manifestation of that will to power. It wields you and you wield it in that magnificent dance, in that tantric act. That is the force, that centrality and that sovereignty and that will to power, right? That man in his absolute state of seriousness is the greatest and single most dangerous threat to the brotherhood. It is that is the true focus of all their shenanigans. Not all the other things that you've heard about. The people at the top of the pyramid, the highest ones, have this actual selfhood as the thing they can stand the least, because they themselves don't have it. That's why they spawn hives and global thinks and Borg realities, okay? They don't have it. They never will. They're the possessed. They're the sorcerers. And they've wiped out nations of people who taught what we're discussing today. They have wiped them out to the last people. The genocide of my race, of so many people's races, is based on this principle, because it is a light that they cannot stand. It's absolutely foul and evil to them, and they automatically have to do something about it in exactly the same way that a roach scuttles the moment you put the light on. It's automatic. They can't do anything else. It's such a disease to feel that vibe of self-realized people around them. I introduced you to the word imagination and said it's the greatest word in the English language. If you want to top it, I can do it. But I would say they're equal. And these words don't require, these words will free you from Bibles, Korans, and what's the other one? Torah, Talmuds, and any other palava that you can possibly want to wave in somebody's face as the truth. And they're two simple words. In Greek it's called nothi suthon, and in English it means know thyself. And those words are the root of all science, magic, religion, mysticism, yoga, and anything else you want to name. Know thyself. But you need the imagination to do it. So they go together. Now, they want to make these prison walls, as we said, they want to make it so stressful that even if you decide, oh, I'm an outsider, okay, go ahead, try to wear that shirt for a while then. And they want you to be banging at the doors, go let me in, I hate it out here. I'm too lonely. Right? So they're going to say, okay, let that fool go. He'll be back. We've got him on a long lead. Right? So the threat is the selfish man is the greatest single threat. All the other shenanigans that they get up to, all that other malarkey, right, is part of the design. It's regiments, it's battalions, it's strategy. We're not going to tell this general what it's really about, but get him, and then he'll have a lieutenant, and we'll have a couple of foot soldiers and a couple of pawns over there. None of them need to know any of this. Get him working on the Federal Reserve. Get the Jews doing their little thing over here. Get those Jesuits moving over here. Get the royals to do their number. Let's put all of this stuff, as we said, the funding of the New Age. The lieutenants have no idea what's going on, what this is all about. They don't need to know. All the controllers are about is, can we hear, hail the providers. Until they hear that, hail the global village, they're not satisfied. And slowly, slowly, the chant is rising. We are shouting at the top. We're going to be getting to the point where we're screaming, let me in, hail the providers. I have no inner self. I don't even know what it means to exist anymore. Here I am living, but I don't feel anything inside. Hey, Doc, THX 1138, wasn't it? Equilibrium, The Matrix, the movies go on and on. Zardoz, I mean, it's all there for the eye to see. It's in the works we're sharing today. So obviously, they're very happy to find you running around in the pigsty that they created for you, using the weapons that they've handed you, and say, down with the Illuminati. It sounds lovely when you say it. When you have no will to power, you ain't going to move anything. You couldn't pull a rotten tooth from a dead horse's head with that. You're not a self. How can you act? You know what you'll end up doing? Exchanging one tyranny for another. And all your expense and all historical time and the death of countless thousands, all right, the Idi Amins, the Stalins, and the whoever else, haven't they all been doing that? Every single one of them has promised you freedom, liberty, and fraternity, and they've only become tyrants in their stead. So much for your social activity and political action. I'm not saying stop it. Do whatever needs to be done and be motivated, but don't put your whole self into it, because you need that in reserve for the real work that needs to be done. So when you see these, we are you, global brotherhood, I am who I am because of everyone, which I've elaborated on in so many other presentations, what that just means is, yes, well, I am who I am because of everyone. Translated from the doublespeak, I'm in the same mess you're in, and you're in the same mess I'm in. Because to a collectivist, not only does he believe that everything he's got and thinks about and does is everybody's property. See how marvelous that sounds? Everything I am, everything I create, everything I do is for my brothers and sisters in the world. It's really, really lovely. It really sounds good. Until you find the small print. Everything you do, everything you create, and everything you think is also my property. We're here to serve. It's for your own protection. Okay? It doesn't sound so good the other way, because it's a rape disguised as something else. It's colonization. It's here, psychic invasion, colonization of the soul. You're infected with these collectivist memes. He says it clearly, Alan Watts. The most strongly enforced of all known taboos is the taboo against knowing who and what you really are behind the mask of your apparently separate, independent, and isolated ego. The ego is the social construction. It's the construction of the world, of everybody else. It's just a chimera. Wilhelm Reich, again, one of the greats who helped to physicalize all of this abstract psychology, if you will, He said, we're barely understanding the awful deviation from pathological degeneration of the human animal. We're in the early stages of even realizing what the problem is, let alone asking the question. And my point here that I'm trying to make is that the very intelligence that we need to work this out, to do that homework, we're losing. Our kids are losing it from the awful systems of the teaching, the schooling. The magician Aleister Crowley sums it up in the language that he prefers, and I very much think he does a good job. He says here that anyone who is forced from his own course, either through not understanding himself or through external imposition, right, Mitwelt, Umwelt, other people, mom and dad, comes into conflict with the order of the universe, the harmony of the universe. You're in conflict with it. It's not going to let you on to you. It's not going to show you that because it's mimicking your disorder, right? And you suffer accordingly. So all that stress, distress, anxiety, and chaos that we experience on a daily basis is explained in the simple fact that you're out of touch with yourself, out of touch with the magic. So Ayn Rand says, a genuine selfishness, that is a genuine concern with one's, with discovering, a genuine concern with discovering what is to one's self-interest and acceptance of the responsibility of achieving it, a refusal never to betray it by acting on blind whim, mood, impulse, or feeling of the moment, an uncompromising loyalty to one's judgment, convictions, and values represents a profound moral achievement. To show how far we are away from this, just go home and do a simple exercise. Think, don't judge yourself for it. I must make that very clear. Do not act self-sadistically and then cause a problem after you should be seeing a solution. Just think about how much other people's existence and welfare preoccupy your thinking. Don't critique yourself for it. Don't judge yourself for it. Just observe it. And hopefully do it a lot. And you might be surprised. And then also think about whether you like it or not. Maybe you want a lot of other people to be thinking what a marvelous person you are, and you to be doing it likewise. It all boils down to attitudinal independence. What I've also described as an anarchy of the mind, anarchy of your mind. Nietzsche puts it this way, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will often be lonely and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay, remember, for the privilege of owning yourself. That's the message that needs to get out. That's exactly the kind of thing that they're working 24/7 to stop happening by every conceivable means. And when you study their means, it becomes really interesting to study what they're doing. E. Cummings, he says, to be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you like everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any being can fight and never stop fighting. That's why you need the extra bioenergy to be able to do it. If you're falling for the tool, if you're fighting them with the weapons they provided you and in the political pigsty and burning out all of your energy, do you think you're going to have any energy or time for this? That's the plan. Come on over here, trauma, economic meltdowns, wars and rumors of wars, swine flu and all sorts of other pestilence. It's easy. They sit back smoking their cigars, clinking their glasses, and they can't believe how easy it is. The French philosopher who worked so extensively on the concept of time, how it factors into this, says liberty consists in being entirely oneself. Henry Bergson. Liberty consists in being entirely oneself. I want to get to that part on children before we finish. Yeah. Here's where we are. Remember in the introduction, I was talking about the fact that the historical trauma is so absolutely recent that we're almost in an infantile, not almost, but we are in an infantile state of trauma, the effects of the trauma, and even thinking. The ego itself is so young. So our position on the map is pretty much as any child would be in psychological terms. And I said, remember I told you there was good news and bad news about that? The good news is that obviously that means that we do actually have a room for optimism to say that in time, right, historically as we continue, things will get better because the trauma will heal. Just like in any wreck or car accident or major trauma, given time, you heal. So the whole human race, the whole psyche is actually, technically speaking, in an actual healing curve. But the downside is Big Brother knows that. And again, they're in it to kill. They know that. They know the history. They knew about pre-Diluvian disasters before anybody found out about it. So they know that we're in this traumatized state. In fact, as we've been pointing out, they thrive on it. Their power comes from it. But the problem is they also know that if you give too much freedom and peace and quiet to people, they might heal. I mean, really dramatically. So they're in with all of that cacophony of disaster again to make sure that we stay in this completely infantile state with our little petty rebellions and what have you. They want to keep us in this regressed, animistic, autistic level, the pleasure principle, right? No delayed gratification. And in the absolute chronic boredom that is so ubiquitous in our world today. Nearly concluding to the last few slides here. A couple of very important points though. And that is that, look, one thing I've said a lot about evil, and that is that evil has within it the seeds of its own destruction. That's again, an optimistic understanding, right? I've gone into it at length in other works, so we don't need to talk about that here. One caveat to that is that evil exists by the subversion of the natural. It doesn't actually have any existence of its own. Evil, by definition, is the subversion of the healthy, the sane, and the natural. That's how it gets to be what it is. And therefore, through constant doses of stress, through the three-hearted monsters, the enemies at the gates, the reds under the beds, the whole saber-rattling financial meltdown nonsense and all the other stuff that comes with it, is to medicate us so that the good anxiety that we need, that beautiful anxiety that we need to relate with and kiss a couple of times and befriend every day, that goes out the door with the pathological one, you see. Because when they're snapping at your ass and you're groveling for the little pennies that they throw you, when there's all this treasure is within your mind and you're having these external authorities, they're happy. They can just go and swat their golf balls or do whatever they're doing, knowing full well that you don't catch on. The point I've been making is that know thine enemy and the weapons that they're using, the ingredients of tyranny, the ingredients of collectivism. And the most important thing is don't follow the tiger out of the long grass. Don't fight them with the weapons they're using. That's as good as, Little Red Riding Hood. You know where she'll end up. They don't want you to find out what we're talking about. They don't want you to find out about that all-important connection between physical reality and psychic reality, right? They don't want you to know that. Remember Jung's famous quote about what you do not make conscious appears outside of you as fate? They don't want you to know that. They know all about it. That's how they can manipulate us, by that process and pulling on the anxiety strings and what have you. But they don't want you knowing about it so that you can snap that cord and go, over, pal, it's cut, I'm done. I'm not two dissonant voices anymore. I am one string with two exceptional voices that I want to listen to that make the world what it is, that give music to my life. You can't just live in a one-season major chord world or a minor chord world either. They don't want you to have that psychic immunity. And finally, we're at the point where I have a message about the future. I think it's the most practical piece of advice I give, and it's the most practical solution as well. And since what we might want to call a generation could be 18 to 20 years, right? So if you have a child now, he's able to function properly in the world, intelligently, and even have his own kids by what? The least is 18, so let's be generous and say 20. So what I have to say in finale here is that basically, look, and I really do strongly believe this. I've taught a lot of children, and I know this is true. It means what I'm saying is that theoretically, in 20 years, evil, what we know as evil, could be completely gone from the world. I'm not saying that in any type of flippant way or, sort of like in any sort of rhetorical way. I mean it absolutely physically, that evil exists, we know it exists. We've suffered for God knows how many millennia, but it can be erased, absolutely, and quite simply. And the starting point is the discernment. All children have an absolute inbuilt natural meter for bullshit and destructive people, until they run into mum and dad who force them to shut it off. Now, it's there even in kids where you would think they're kind of destructive. No, it's there. It is there. It may be very faint. It may be, the knob turned down, but it's there in all kids. All kids, I don't care what they are. I've seen them in all descriptions. It's there until we shut it off. So, and of course, don't forget that in order to teach a kid discernment, you might have to have it too, but let's completely forget about that. The very fact of being able to teach a child discernment, to tell between good and evil, right and wrong, and something about the energy of another person, is to strengthen the bullshit meter so that in the life of that child, in one life of one child, by the time that he's created the next generation, evil cannot exist. Because, as I said before, evil has the seeds of its own destruction within it. Now that sounds mighty poetic until it's really unpacked. What it means is that evil always, 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 always is a subversion of that which is healthy and good and pure, right? And then unpacking that a bit more, we understand that evil is literally the wolf in sheep's clothing. Without a guise of good, it can't exist. Without the sheep's clothing, the wolf will be exposed. Now, the wolf gets away. If you don't know the difference between a wolf and a sheep, well, then you're dead. You're eaten. But if you could know the difference between the sheep and the wolf's game is up. In fact, it's a comedy. Now look at that idiot. What's he think he's doing? The wolf becomes an object of complete humor. Just like they will become an object of complete and utter humor. And you could dust them off like the dust that they are. Politically and psychologically and spiritually. You can take them up. Then it comes toddling out from behind the curtain, that big monster. Right? The demon turns to an angel after all because you've done something so simple. You've unmasked the lie. But you can only do it in one generation or two by teaching the children to not shut off that bullshit meter. Not telling this person's good, smile, it's good, and all this nonsense. When they're saying, I don't like that person, I don't want to like that person. And encourage that energy to flow. Let it really open up and flow. And you'll see wonders take place. Because the moment that just a handful, and if you have 10 of those children, just like they show the movie Dune in that incredible George Herbert book, 10 teach 100, 100 teach 1,000, 1,000 teach 10,000. And evil doesn't know what act to perform. Evil is out of a job completely. Go home and think about what I'm saying and tell me that evil can stand when discernment exists. Discernment has always been signified by a sword. Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, to know the truth from the lie. And if your children know it, and it's already in them, it just doesn't need to be overclouded and shut down, and bombarded with a bunch of depend on everybody else and shut off that natural organic intelligence. And then you will see a steady decline in that. Now, R.D. Laing puts it this way: long before the thermonuclear war can come about, we have had laid waste to our own sanity. We begin with the children. It is imperative to catch them in time. Without the most thorough and rapid brainwashing, their dirty minds, without us doing it, they would see through our dirty tricks. Children are not yet fools, but we shall turn them into imbeciles like ourselves, with high IQs if possible. Specifically, this devastation is largely the work of violence that has been perpetuated on each of us, right? We are the children that I'm talking about. We had that happen to us. You wouldn't be sitting in this room if it didn't happen to you. You'd be walking out there with the mindless zombies in the Umwelt, turned on by all the freaking stimuli and the Oprah Winfrey hypnotism, the Srangali stuff. You're here precisely because of what we're talking about. We've come full circle. This is you. If this didn't happen to you, you would not be here. You wouldn't be opening a book. You would have no quest. He says, specifically, this devastation is largely the work of the violence that has been perpetrated to each of us. And by each of us on ourselves, right? The self-sadism. All the top psychologists never, ever forget that. Self-sadism. Its technical term is masochism, but let's call it what it is. Self-violence, self-murder. Now, the usual name that much of this violence goes under is love. I've said before in my other talks that it's not fear, it's not violence, it's not hatred that's contaminating the world. It's false love. Love posing as something else. The Indian mystic Osho says everybody is living in bondage because everybody who brought you up wanted to have power over you and enjoy the mastery over you. And children are the most helpless people in the world, the most exploited class. It is not the proletariat who are the most exploited class. It is not the women who are the most exploited class. It is the children who are the most exploited class. And we are that child. He was that child. Now, we are presently right now moving through a great doorway, all of us together. 2012, the Maya concept, the Stargate, the Tree of Life, whatever, the Boat of the Pharaoh, whatever you want to talk about, C.S. Lewis's Last Battle, where the kids are taken through a great gate and they watch the apocalypse. And they so much want to do something about it. But they're told, no, you can't. This has to happen. There is something rotten in Denmark. You can't be all right with it. You can't go and save it. You can't be okay with injustice or unjust people. When the Armageddon comes, you have to take it. You have to let it happen. You might want to go and run and save them, but you've killed yourself. If they can run up and keep up with you, then you run together as two stallions. But the moment that they fall behind, you dare not turn to save them, because in doing that you cripple yourself. These are laws. They cannot be talked around in some Fabian claptrap. Because Tennyson's wild bells are at this very moment ringing out the old and ringing in the new. On that Siddhartha road, there's room only for one. Yeah, another can follow you, another can go ahead of you, but only one. You can't walk side by side with anything but yourself and the love you have for your own shadow. The only thing that can accompany you on your Siddhartha road is the love you have for your own anxiety, your misery, your stress. Can't you love it? Can't you let it wash over you? Can't you take it in your arms instead of trying to medicate it? Remember the legend of Orpheus. Don't turn back. The world may give meaning to what you do, but you give meaning to what you are. And the thing is, the beautiful thing about it is, whether you do that or not, Umwelt is going on, the universe is still going to turn. You may completely disregard everything we're talking about and discussing and say, no, I'm not for that. It won't matter to the Umwelt, it won't matter to the stars and the universe. Its life does stay in harmony and continue. You are the one who rises and falls. You are the one who is here ephemerally for a moment, an instant. You are the flicker on the flame, not the universe. That's going to be on eternally. You are the one who's ephemeral, the ego, your thoughts. Schopenhauer says a consciousness is destroyed in death, certainly. We know that. We're going to die. Every single person in this room will die, as all animals die. But that which has produced life is by no means destroyed. The moment that you align yourself with that, you are not dead, you live eternally. I can use a metaphor of matches. If you strike a match, this mysterious ethereal thing called a flame appears on this matter, right? The matter is the stick. That's the body. That's your consciousness. The spirit comes on that match, but the match burns down and it's over. You light another match. There it is again. You light another match. Light candles, right? Light all the lights in the world. Light the suns. Fill the universe with matches and suns. Fill the entire cosmos with burned out matches, and the flame still comes. You haven't destroyed the flame one iota. It's not one less poverty-stricken, weakened, less rich, less abundant than it was on the first match to the trillionth match. So it is with your body. You come and you go. That spirit is so much more vast. And it's speaking in you all the time. The dialogue between your organs, as the Egyptians said, your skin, your hands, your feet, the very sweating, the person playing a musical instrument, the body's not intelligent. Half the time the body acts faster in trauma than your brain even knows. We know that. We have the anecdotes. It's provable. That in many cases, physically on record, the body moves faster, right? With memory and so on than before them. If you waited for your mind, you'd be dead or crushed or whatever. We also call it intuition. It works all the time to protect us. But this point by Schopenhauer is the key point. You can identify with that body and that match and think like the physicalists do, listen, that's all what it's all about. Or you can identify with that flame. That's, again, your choice, the human choice. It's all a question of reality versus illusion. Now, what I said before is that the illusion passes away, right? The canvas passes away. The reality, which is the nature that's being painted, is everlasting. Your canvas can die and pass away, but there's no destruction to that which is absolutely real. So you don't have to listen to these physicalists who are holding civilization back and all of their materialistic palaver. You need to go through that door alone, when I mean that spiritually, consciously, and open the door, to another kind of being, the doors of perception. As Heidegger pointed out, the man who's going to be enlightened and free and self-aware is the man who turns his thought, German Denken, into thanks, into gratitude. They're based on the same word root. Thank you to everything for life is the same word, the same origin as the word thinking. So when your thought is a perpetual act of gratitude, when your bowl is so open that it can never be unfilled, then you are there at that center, at that space. And you are at the center, as he says. The seriousness is there and the center is there. You need be no other place. On a circle, movement is illusion because you are at that very point, at the very place you need to be. The walking is an illusion. on a circle, you're always at the place you need to be. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to be back in Manchester, in England. We'll end there.
Michael TSARION.